Good afternoon. Hello, I'm Professor Gail McPherson, the Director of the Centre for Culture, Sport and Events at UWS. And with me are Professor David McGilvray, Deputy Director, and Dr. Sandro Carnacelli. We welcome you to the live stream of our virtual conference, Festivals and Events and COVID-19, Navigating a Global Pandemic. I would like to thank everyone for joining from one of our 4 live streams, and I hope everything stands up technically, remembering we're all broadcasting from lockdown. We have nearly 400 people registered for the conference from across the UK and beyond, and we want to make sure you can participate in this afternoon's conversation with an interesting mix of questions and comments on your chosen platform. For Twitter users, we're using the hashtag CCSE Futures, and you can pose questions there as well as via our YouTube channel and other live streams from our speakers. The Centre for Culture, Sport and Events has been in operation for just nearly 2 years, and we cover a range of themes, and part of those themes will be the 3 areas that we're looking at today. We decided to host a virtual conference in order to make a contribution to the festivals and events sector and lead a discussion about how the sector can navigate the current crisis and what the future might look like over the next few months and years. We'd originally planned with our partners at Renfrewshire Council to host a traditional conference in May, but the global crisis made that impossible. However, as the scale of the pandemic became evident, we felt that it was important to pool our collective resources and convene a virtual event to attend to the serious health, economic, social and cultural impact of the virus on the sectors that our centre is concerned with. Pre-COVID-19, Allied Market Research had forecast that festivals and events to be worth over $2,000 billion globally by 2026 to the economy. But for me, that only represents a small part of the story. Festivals and events, sporting and culture offer the opportunity for international cultural exchange, which has been taking place through things like the Great Expos since 1851, creating space and place for trade and industry, meaning, hope, and memory-making possibilities in people's lives. Socially and culturally, festivals and events offer the chance to live, participate, grieve, and bond with others. These are not just experiences to be consumed, but important markers of identity, time, and place in people's lives. Once the stringent restrictions are relaxed, it may be that smaller events held locally with a neighbourhood or community focus will increase in importance. But larger sporting and cultural festivals and events also need a future. And for now, many of these events are planned without audiences or have moved to be delivered digitally. But there remain big questions as to whether these formats can work financially for the sector. We'll be discussing these and related issues throughout the afternoon. Before we do, David will briefly introduce the 3 themes for this afternoon's sessions. Thanks.
Thanks, Gail. So starting very soon, we have a great lineup of industry experts, policymakers, and also academic commentators from around the world, covering the 3 main themes that Gail's addressed. These themes were chosen because they map perfectly with the interests of the Centre for Sport, Culture and Events, and also of major research projects that colleagues are working on across the Centre at this very moment. So first up today, we have a session on cultural festivals and events, which Gail will chair. This discussion aligns closely with a large European project called FestSpace that I lead within the Centre, which considers a relationship between festivals, events and public space across Europe, working with partners in Glasgow, London, Dublin, Barcelona and Gothenburg. This is a particularly interesting piece of research at a time when co-presence and social proximity is replaced with a discourse of social distancing. And a number of our academic partners will be contributing to sessions this afternoon. Second, I will chair a session on the future of sport events, which builds on research expertise in our centre on major and mega sporting events, focusing specifically on issues relating to disability, human rights, and their mediation. This work includes projects on event rights and the most effective ways to leverage parasport events to improve the lives of disabled people. And finally, this afternoon, our centre colleague and subject lead for tourism and events and marketing, Dr. Sandro Carnacelli, will chair a session that looks at the creative responses we've seen in our local communities, in our streets, squares, parks, and even balconies during the COVID-19 pandemic, and considers what these festive forms might mean for the future shape of our public spaces and our festivals and events. Each of this afternoon's sessions will operate as a separate discussion, but we hope you'll be able to find something relevant and interesting in each to keep your attention. We don't expect to be able to address in full the myriad issues that a global pandemic throws up for culture, for sport, for events, but we do hope to provide some useful thoughts and ideas that can help ensure that when we do emerge from its worst effects, there's a thriving, creative and sporting landscape to enjoy. We've asked our speakers not to use visuals in their talks to avoid technological problems that may arise, but they will be sharing some graphics via social media during this afternoon. We'll be monitoring social media traffic and we'll pull together some questions to direct to each of the speakers in each of the sessions. There's likely to be a lot of activity, so apologies if we don't manage to ask your question. We'll also then have short breaks between each session to allow viewers to take a comfort break and, if relevant, to contribute to their homeschooling effort. Now I'm going to hand back to Gail to lead us into the first session on cultural festivals and events.
Thank you, David. We're now going to start our first session. It's called Cultural Festivals, Performing at a Distance. Today, I would like to welcome you to Mary Christie, Head of Development at Visit Scotland, Lindsay Jackson, Deputy Chief Executive of Edinburgh Festival Fringe Society, Louisa Mann, Head of Marketing and Communications at Renfrewshire Council, and Bernadette Quinn, academic from Technological University, Dublin. In this panel, we will hear from these policymakers, industry partners and academics from the UK and Europe on the impact of COVID-19 on the cultural sector, with a specific focus on cultural festivals and events. In this session, we'll discuss two main questions. What are the effects, economically, socially and culturally, of COVID-19 on cultural festivals? And what are the implications of COVID-19 for the future of cultural festivals? And how do you think we will work differently? So we're going to start off with the first question, and each of our speakers will take it in turn to give their perspective on that. And then we'll move on to the second question. So Mary, if I could ask you to take the floor and talk to us about the first question. What are the effects economically, socially and culturally of COVID-19 on cultural festivals from your perspective?
Thanks, Gail, and thanks for inviting me along to take part in the panel today. I'm looking forward to the discussion. So as you said, I'm Head of Development within Visit Scotland's Events Directorate, and events are a huge focus for Visit Scotland. Our Events Directorate includes, just for clarity, Event Scotland, Visit Scotland Business Events and Events Development, and I head up the latter for a bit of context for my comments. So what are the effects? Well, I think it's uncontroversial to say that the economic effects in the short to medium term are devastating. Events are a huge contributor to Scotland's economic, social and cultural life, and they were cancelled with immediate effect in March, with further instructions wiping out the summer season and sending event organisers into crisis mode. So 2020 is unlikely to see more than a very limited live event activity, and 2021, in my view, will see a very cautious return, with events looking to remodel themselves within the context of social restrictions, public sentiment, and in response to the developing economic situation. The First Minister's route map out of lockdown, published last week, suggests only very small events, up to 500, could take place as we move into phase 3, whilst in phase 4, large-scale events and mass gatherings could resume in line with public health advice and restrictions. So this means that events as we know them won't be returning for some time. Our Edinburgh festivals alone generate more than 300 million for Scotland's economy, and their absence will be really sharply felt by thousands of businesses that benefit from audience spend and by supplying the festivals directly. But the same picture is repeated in every part of the country on different scales, from Wigtown with its book festival in the south to the Western Isles and the Head Celt Festival in the north. Events are an essential part of our economic health for our cities and our communities across the whole country, bringing visitors, generating spend and creating work. Many cultural events work on a 9 to 12 month planning cycle, and often organisations are focused on the delivery of one annual festival. So if that opportunity is lost, the cash flow and survival issues are significantly exacerbated. I would say that there are shoots of hope, though. For example, a high proportion of festival goers have retained their tickets for postponed events, and in some cases, festival friend schemes have allowed their fee to be repurposed for resilience. So that's great indications of loyalty and support in really difficult times. However, it also can't be ignored that finances will continue to be stretched to the max. The public sector will be under unprecedented pressure, and all investments are expected to be heavily scrutinised going forwards. There will also be significant risk regarding commercial income from sponsors and ticket sales. So trying to manage the impact of cancellations has been the primary focus for many over the past few weeks. And as we start to look ahead, it's the additional costs that will be required to mount events in this new normal that will become an increasing additional threat to the economic viability of events, and therefore the economic benefits that we're used to seeing across the country. So really difficult position economically right now that we're all trying to work through. Socially, events, as you've said, Gail, they bring communities together in work, creativity, as audiences and as participants. Many of our music festivals represent rites of passage for our young folk, and for many, our annual cultural festivals are an essential part of social life, creating moments to be together, make memories, celebrate. They really are parts of the fabric of our life. But also the majority of events, the vast majority, offer really valuable volunteering and engagement opportunities, which are vital for so many people from a social and well-being perspective. So, significant losses in the short term this year, certainly there. And in terms of culture, well, our need for culture and creativity has really come to the fore during lockdown, with the resurgence of people reconnecting with their own creativity to help cope with the situation, from taking part in virtual choirs to registering for things like online guitar lessons, things that you've always meant to do. And the value of culture and creativity has never been clearer. But it's fantastic to see so many festivals have been responding to the situation and developing online content, often in the form of virtual festivals. And I think it's really important both for meeting that need that we've demonstrated to be fed and connected culturally, but also to keep our festivals front of mind. So looking forward, another key concern that's coming through strongly is the need to ensure that creative content is developed and created for restart. And particularly given so many festival workers are furloughed currently, and so many organisations are in very difficult positions. And also the absence of the showcase opportunity that some of our cancelled festivals usually provide, and how this will impact on cultural programming for 21 and beyond. And I know Lindsay will certainly have a lot to say from the fringe perspective for that. But again, there are shoots of positivity coming through. Conversations are underway to see what can be done sooner rather than later in some festival contexts to create new forms of live creative content that can be developed in response to the restrictions in the shorter term. And I'm really looking forward to the development of those plans. And I suppose, finally, I would say that, our cultural festivals are by definition creative, and they're hopefully well placed to be innovative and create innovative solutions to the current context. And what we need to do in the public sector is support them through this time to do exactly that, to innovate in this current context and looking forward, and to ensure that the sector is ready to restart and bring us together for that irreplaceable, shared, live cultural experience. I think you're on mute, Gail.
Thank you, Mary, for that. Yes, I was wondering when we could play that bingo game. I'll seamlessly hand over to Lindsay now. Thank you.
Thanks. And actually, it's a good thing that Mary went first, because while that was quite stark and sort of heartbreaking at times, it reminds us what we've been through and actually where we are. I think from a personal point of view, I worry the effects of this pandemic could be yet to come in our sector if we're not careful about how we support recovery. And it is really reassuring that seems to be a collective thought across the sector. Within the fringe context, first and foremost, the biggest impact we're seeing and will continue to see is the livelihood of our artists and those who work in the sector. I think we've all learned a very hard and stark lesson about how precarious the culture sector is and how fine the balance of that survival can be. And that's true from small arts organisations all the way up to national cultural institutions. I'm hopeful that this will give us a good evidence base for increased support and subsidy, but mindful that we're facing a global recession, we may find our sector and its needs are quite far down the list of priorities for recovery. In the fringe context, as Mary alluded to, we're not only the largest and greatest arts festival in the world, we're also the largest arts marketplace. We have thousands of industry that come to the festival to buy work, to engage in onward touring opportunities, for showcasing, to build new partnerships and commissions, to scout new talent, both stage and screen. And there's a huge alumni of the fringe that you'll know and love. And this is actually a huge part of why many artists participate, because there are significant opportunities to develop your career, whatever stage of that career you're at. And we know that many artists will pivot their whole year around the fringe, whether they're emerging and they're saving up all their money to throw everything they have at making the most of their opportunity, or conversely, if the bookings they make annually at the fringe offer them work for the following year and 2 years. We do know the industry are still booking for 2021, and one of our key priorities is to ensure that we find ways to help artists and industry find one another and maintain this supply chain so that new work is still made. I think from an economic perspective, the revenue models that are prevalent in our sector and very prevalent in the fringe that depend on ticket income, the majority of their income are going to be incredibly challenging to recover. I have personal concerns this is going to lead to increased and exclusionary pricing for our audiences. If it's not underwritten and subsidised by funders and stakeholders, we need to think very carefully about how we balance the needs of our income for our organisations and our artists alongside our audience development and accessibility of pricing in order that we can ensure that culture remains accessible to all. I think that our employees are already hugely undervalued, and we've got real risks around talent drain, particularly those working class and marginalised voices who may find they just cannot afford to work in our sector any longer, which is quite worrying for a number of us. From an audience perspective, we're getting sort of wildly different demands from audiences. There's the want to promote content and entertainment and culture, but the public mood is so variable and it's so difficult to predict. We want to be part of that, but we also don't want to come across as frivolous or insensitive. So we're watching how artists are navigating that space and how they're rebuilding that audience confidence to come out, or even in the first instance to join them digitally and then to rejoin public event spaces as and when we're allowed to. And how we as a sector can engage with the research that's happening to help make sure people feel safe to come and join us. But there is still a desire to have fun and to share something together. We have to not forget that we got into the events industry largely because we like to entertain people. We like to make people have a good time. And I think that's still very possible in these times. And I think the festivals and the cultural sector more widely can and will continue to offer us space to escape from and be distracted from or make sense of what's happening in society and how society has changed. And I would imagine that artists across the country, whether consciously or not, whether they're still working as an artist or they're caring for their children or they're a full-time primary school teacher or they're working in a supermarket, somewhere in their brain they'll be reframing and rethinking what of their cultural work will have relevance and importance in the society that we emerge into. I think there's some assessment needed of the model of developing new work. I agree with Mary that Bennett and Gail that we need to ensure that new work can be made. And I would worry if funders are going to place all of the value on remounting work for touring, as this is arguably cheaper and that product is ready. I think there is a space for remounting work, and we can help artists maximise the return on that investment and get that work out the door quickly. But we really do need to ensure that new work can be supported and developed. And the importance of festivals like the Fringe, which is an open access festival, is those artists need space to fail and they need space to try things that do not work. And I think that's really important to move our sector forward. And then finally, while digital is serving a purpose in the short term and there is some engagement, we need to think very carefully about the value of the live work and what it means to be there and what it means to participate and what it means to be present, both for joy and for collective sort of grief or understanding or comprehension. And that's not just about being present and being together. I think there's always the assumption that digital is free, and we need to make sure that as we move forward into a blended model of present and digital, that we're not undermining the value of the artist's work, and that we're able to ensure that audiences understand that that content is still created by a person. And that's all for me.
Finishing on a really important point there about digital not being free, you're absolutely right. And I think we have to be mindful of the digital divide that we have, and that not everybody can afford to engage digitally either with devices. And that takes me neatly onto Louisa, who is running events in Paisley, where live events are very much part of their strategy, but also trying to engage digitally, but mindful that we have elements of the population who can't all afford that. Louisa, can I hand over to you? Thanks.
Thanks so much, Gail, and thank you to the speakers who've gone before and for having me today. And I think we all concur that the economic impact of the cancellation of events is having a profoundly negative impact locally and nationally. For a town like Paisley, to quantify that, you know, it's close to 200,000 visitors a year and millions of pounds worth of economic impact and local spend and jobs, and the very essence of what makes our high streets and our town centres healthy. I also think it's probably too early even now to properly understand just how deep the impact is going to be. I think the whole sort of furlough that we've got in place, and thankfully it's there, it does to a certain extent mask what the longer term impacts may be post, you know, June or July, as we head into recovery and we get a real sense as we come together, as measures are eased and we start to, you know, reinvent and heal as a sector. Only then I think we'll really understand the true cost, you know, financially, but also culturally. And we currently are working very hard. You may be aware our entire 2020 programme has been cancelled up until the very end of the year, where we're still making the decision on the events at the back end of the year, but that you know, it is likely we will have to reconsider those as well. So we have focused on how we continue to work really closely with the artists, the promoters, the supply chain, everyone who was involved in choreographing that programme, and seeing how we can be, you know, not lose any of the work that, you know, has gone in. As it's been, you know, rightly mentioned, you know, events are months and, you know, and close to a year in the planning. And, you know, for us, it's about how we really protect the sector locally and not lose any of that really valuable work that's taken place up until now. There's no doubt the impact is great. You know, our major events programme are a symbol, you know, in terms of place, that they're a symbol of our, you know, town's resilience, of our creative endeavour, and they've been a massive part of the, you know, transforming perceptions of our area and the impact that's then had on, you know, people want to live in Paisley, move to Renfrewshire, relocate their businesses. A massive sort of destination piece, and events have been a central pillar in that. You know, they're also our key visitor product, which is, you know, why the partnership working with Event Scotland and Visit Scotland becomes so critical to us. They're also a significant contributor to the lives and livelihoods of our communities, and I mean that in the widest sense. The entire sort of all the cast members that are involved in events, and, you know, the local groups, our retailers, our traders, you know, the sort of network of supporting and active participants, our venues, our cafes, our restaurants, that entire fabric of the town, which is fragile, you know, faces an even more uncertain future, and you know, our events are free, so they also require considerable public sector support and funding. And I think we have to be realistic moving forward that, The collaborative approach with the industry bodies is going to be essential, because we are going to be at a point of a really fine balancing act of covering the costs of the initial response to the crisis, the humanitarian toll, but also how we fund recovery, and just how, as has been mentioned, just how much of a priority will events be. I hope they will be. I think they're a hugely important part of how we will heal and recover as a community, but I do think we have to be practical. As Lindsay's mentioned, I think the impact on artists and producers and the impact on our supply chain, we're really concerned about that. It's really important to preserve those local networks. And again, I think, furlough might be masking, some of the impact of that. And how many of our suppliers and our partners will actually survive through to 2021. It's actually quite a long journey, and we're really keen to make sure that our local infrastructure is able to cope. Socially, I think lockdown's held a magnifying glass up to probably the best and worst of the human condition, and thankfully it's highlighted that physical connection and shared experience are kind of core to who we are. And I totally agree, festivals represent celebration, their rewards, their highlights in our calendars, their reasons for people to look forward, their vehicles to employment. And at a time like this, when there's very little certainty about the future, not having our events and our festivals as an anchor actually starts to have quite an impact on people's well-being and spirit. We had an outpouring of support and sadness when we cancelled the programme, and it was a real reminder of how important festivals are to telling the story of a place and to telling the story of communities, and the losses absolutely fell. I'm sure I speak for everyone when it's very difficult to stare at an empty events calendar and empty venues and empty unused spaces. I think that has a very detrimental impact on communities, and it does need to be addressed as part of our recovery. There are good things, I agree. I think it's really galvanising us as a cultural sector and an events industry, and that's something to really hold on to and value. Because I think there's a real understanding about how we contribute to wellness and community and sense of belonging. I think it's also provoked, real ingenuity, and people are expressing themselves across the country in so many ways. We're still having mass gatherings. Clap for Carers is an exceptional example of that. People are in their bedrooms and kitchens and in their gardens, but they are finding a way to tap into their innate creativity and to produce content and tell their stories and develop their confidence in doing that. And I think anything that allows that, still has to be celebrated and acknowledged as being a real positive.
Absolutely. I think that would resonate with what many people are feeling across the country just now, Louisa, and people are desperately trying to come together in some form of sense of community and spirit, and to maintain the notion of a togetherness and identity at events, and even if that is more locally at the moment. But I don't think that I'm hearing from MD that they're not really wanting the live event to come back, and I think that's what we're all hoping for and going to see. Bernadette, I'm going to invite in to say a few words on this, because as an academic, you are a key part of the FestSpace project that we're running, and maybe give us some examples from that too.
Thanks, Gail. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I'm an academic and I'm based in Dublin, so I'm giving a slightly different perspective, an Irish perspective and academic perspective. It strikes me, first of all, to say the commonality of themes coming through from the previous speakers is very, very striking, and indeed it's going to reflect exactly what I'm going to say. So we are seeing real similarities here across, internationally, and I think that's something to think about and to hold on to as we try to move forward. I think that the effects of COVID on cultural festivals has been immense, very abrupt and really unimaginable. And I'm going to start with the social and cultural side of things, because in our HERA FestSpace project, we're very interested in the role that festivals can play in including people in society. And I think we're seeing a huge loss, as our previous speakers said, there are huge loss to communities everywhere. People have put months of investment of time and resources and skills and energy, all of which have been disappointed as plans have been shelved or at least curtailed. I think festivals are so important. Our research findings are showing in terms of capacity building, mobilising community efforts, and of course somebody has already spoken about the huge numbers of volunteers that underpin the cultural sector that cannot be underestimated at this point. I think as well, some of the larger festivals have been really brilliant and proven themselves to be very adept at going digital. But I think some of the smaller festivals, even some of the long-standing smaller festivals in Ireland, for example, haven't been able to go digital, and neither have the smaller community festivals. And so there's a real discontinuity there that you would be worried about with going forward in terms of festivals managing to maintain themselves into the future. So that's a real issue, I think. I think maybe, community festivals in urban districts are particularly a huge loss. We're facing into a long summer period now, where many communities are feeling an emptiness, lacking the interesting, fun, enjoyable and positive moments that cultural festivals bring. So there's going to be lots of empty space, vacant hours, idle minds, and there will be negative consequences of that. Somebody already mentioned memory as well. We've got a particular interest in the Festive-Based project in Ireland around commemorative events, and we're in a decade of commemoration in Ireland, and we've had people had to cancel brilliant plans, and the loss and disappointment at the memory loss there is tremendous. Culturally, people have really talked about that a lot already. I think it's incalculable, the networks of creativity and productivity and engagement that cannot happen this year, and the cascading negative effects of loss that are being created in multiple ways. Clearly people within the cultural sector are badly affected, as we've heard, but there's wider cultural impacts too. City councils, for example, often invest in festivals, to enhance the reputation and change the identity of places, to encourage people to think better of places, both locals and outsiders, and that's a loss. Also I'm thinking of ethnic communities. We had Africa Day in Ireland earlier this week, and while there was a virtual presence, it's just not the same. It's no replacement, I don't think, for a physical presence in the public realm where people can really express the full sensory nature of events and cultural festivals that can really transform a place, and we're missing out on all of that. Economically, of course, it's been an absolute disaster, and the precarity of the cultural sector has been exposed yet again. I think this COVID-19 has done this in lots of ways. It's exposed social inequalities. It's not causing them, it's exposing them, bringing them to light. And huge suffering going on in the sector. On the positive side, yes, of course, necessity is the mother of invention, and many professional festivals have been very flexible and creative and innovative. The cynic in me might say that it's a sector that's well practiced at delivering way more than they have the means to do so, and being very inventive at doing things with not a lot of money or not a lot of state support, and reinventing them in multiple ways to meet the demands of different sorts of funders, be it tourism or be it culture or be it urban regeneration. I think the turn to virtual technologies has been fantastic, and there's been lots of strengths there. It's building bridges, it's reaching out to different and maybe new cohorts, it's connecting the cultural sector, and it's upskilling the sector, and it's definitely going to improve the sector in ways. I don't think it's a replacement for physical connectivity, however. Most importantly, and the big thing going on, I think, in Ireland is that it's encouraging retrospection. There's the precarity of the sector is up for discussion yet again, and there's huge conversations going on about the need for the sector to coalesce, to form sector representation, to find a voice. In a way, the absence of festivity is going to now, as the summer goes on, point to us the very presence of it, if you like. In its absence, we will realise perhaps how important it is. Because at the moment, very often, it's very hard for people to actually understand the value of festivity, economically, culturally, or socially. And perhaps now, once it's gone, maybe we might realise some good might come out of that. That's it. Thank you. I'll hand back to Gail.
Thank you, Bernard. Drifted in a little bit
Oh, I'm sorry.
there, so we're hoping that everybody could still hear that okay. I think, no, it's okay. We could hear most of it, so it was really good. I think we've got time at the moment for questions. So a couple of questions on this first theme before we move on to the second theme. And I can see that some people are sending through, there's questions coming through on the feed. And here, let me just read that from you. Is when will we start to survey the audience, as the state of New York has done, to see what it will take to regain the confidence in attending events? And will Event Scotland lead the effort in this way? Lindsay's got her hand up, and then Mary.
I was just going to say there's a great survey already doing the rounds.
Lindsay,
the name escapes me now. I'm sure we can that we can include it in the captions or the notes afterwards. But that's looking at exactly that. And I know we at the Fringe are certainly going to explore how we can ensure that our audience data feeds into that survey rather than doing our own. And it asks key questions about your attitude for returning, but also your attitude for support and recovery levies and ticket price increases and stuff. So if we can feed into a larger national research and UK-wide research database, that would be much more beneficial, we think, in the long term.
Just to add, Gail, that we are
Who was that there? Not sure what happened there. I think I've lost Marie. She's gone out of that. Okay, I'll give you another question. Somebody's put a comment that digital does not mean free, and it's so important that we keep shouting this. So I think that has come through in some of the areas there. And someone else has asked, some people hosting a series of drive-in movies over the summer, and there's been possibilities of drive-in circus performances in Germany. And what's your take on this format of events? Louisa, could I go to you for that? You have to unmute.
I think thank you. I think all these ideas are worth exploring. Anything that allows us to help people re-engage, connect, participate whilst following whatever new guidelines are in place and whatever guidelines remain, I think is really important to building confidence. And a lot of that, I think, needs to start locally. And, you know, we can tell already how keen people are to reconnect at a community and neighbourhood level. And I think it's actually about ensuring that all opportunities that present themselves that allow us for people to have those collective moments of joy and experience that sort of live event feeling where you're in the company of others, it's really worthwhile trialling and trialling it at a local level and seeing how that can then be invested and uplifted, and where we can really share as an industry, you know, the learnings from that, what works, what doesn't. And it's going to be really, really important that, you know, trial and sharing experience and sharing the impact of different formats of events that we put in place. I think there are a number of local authorities from that perspective who are looking at, you know, how we continue with mass fireworks displays, but in locations where people can view from their gardens and from places of distance, etc. So there's massive ways that we can really start to be very, you know, clever and creative, and all those ideas, I think, need to be welcomed and looked at.
That's good. Marie, you're back with us. Do you want to?
I'm kicked off, so you'll have to excuse me.
No, I'm so sorry.
I'm back in, don't worry. Yeah, I think the question before I got cut off there was, what will Event Scotland be doing in that respect? So there's a few studies already underway, and Lindsay, I think when I got cut off there, was mentioning one or two of them. We'll be pulling together that and sharing that through our comms channels. So there's a work stream internally looking at that just now. So make sure that you're plugged into the Event Scotland, Visit Scotland channels and Event Scotland LinkedIn, etc. Sign up to our mailing list, and we'll be sharing much more information as we get it, as we go along.
Okay, I've got one more before we move on to the second question here, from someone that says that following the SARS epidemic, both Hong Kong and Toronto created powerful cross-industry bodies to revive events, tourism and hospitality sectors. And events were at the forefront, and they invested heavily to help revive these industries and signal that they were very much open for business. Is that a possible model for Scotland? Who wants to answer that?
Well, I'll go. Well, I think absolutely events are critical to Event Scotland's reputation and our economic health. So it's important that we work together across the sector, but across Scotland to ensure that we're making the right cases, and we're definitely doing that. One of the things that's coming out of this is the real need for a collaborative voice across the events and festival sector. And certainly over the past few weeks, we've been pulling together a lot of that effort, and you'll be seeing more from Event Scotland facilitating that going forward. So I think it's absolutely essential that we're joined up, that we can make the joined up arguments. But, for me, given the positioning of events and festivals, the fact that we have a national agency for events and festivals in Scotland, a cabinet secretary has the responsibility for events and festivals, it's an absolutely critical aspect of our economic health.
Okay, and actually I have one more question because I've got a very specific question that's come in. I hope that's okay for Bernadette, asking how can we ensure that knowledge exchange is taking place across borders when the lockdown approaches are so different for various countries and locations? Bernadette, can you take that?
Yeah, come on. Yeah. So, well, here's an example of knowledge transfer. We're having one now this moment. So I think this is really good. So I think digital is great to facilitate this kind of exchange. I mean, I would love to know, for example, whether Visit Scotland talk to their Irish equivalents, for example. I think it would be really useful to see knowledge exchange going on at that level. I mean, we have knowledge exchange going on at the academic level, for example, through our international FEST-based project. And the initiative today is part of our efforts to share knowledge. So there's the means. I think, it's a lot about, there's competitive factors, I know, but I think in the interest of the sector as a whole, and indeed at the festival level as well. I mean, there's the National Campaign for the Arts in Ireland is doing a huge amount at the minute to try and lobby the interests of the sector and to get a better voice for government. And I'm sure they're talking to their counterparts elsewhere. So I think we just, in this moment of crisis, I think an openness, and we can all learn from each other and learn from best practice. That's all I can think of at the moment.
Thank you. That's really good. I'm going to second question, and we're going to go in the reverse order for contribution. So Bernadette's implications of COVID, of cultural festivals, and how do you differently. I'm mindful here, Bernadette, about on a global scale, some elements of things like climate change or the UN SDG goals, and how are we aligning these? Are these, I suppose in the event sector we're working quite well in some of these areas and aligning their work to these. Do you think that will come more to the front, to the fore? And in that.
Bernadette, do you maybe want to just respond to that second question? I think Gail maybe has gone out of connectivity.
I lost Gail there a minute ago. Sorry, Gail, can you ask me that again, please?
So I think Gail was asking about the second question, about what the future might look like, maybe something that's in advance of what you talked about in your first response. So, what do we think this will look like in the near future?
So shall I just start by answering the second question? Is that what Gail wants me to do?
Yeah, that would be great, Bernadette.
I wonder.
Perfect.
Yeah. All right then. Okay. So
yes,
I'm going to start taking the second question now, the implications of COVID-19 for the future. So just a few points occur to me here. I think in the very immediate future, now, there's a great deal of uncertainty that's really hard for the sector to deal with. And I think in the first instance, financial supports the state has to support the people on the forefront of the sector at the moment, just to keep the show on the road, as it were, or else I think there will be festivals will fail and people will, lose their jobs. I mean, here in Ireland, we're having a phased return to business. So on June 29th, small gatherings will be allowed back. On August 10th, larger gatherings will be allowed back. But we're not 100% sure, for example, what a larger gathering means. So there needs to be dialogue between the sector and government to try and work out that detail a little bit more. But I don't think anybody's confident that festivals are going to return to normal, maybe even until the end of 2021. So I think initially in the immediate future, we need the sector to continue to receive support from the state. Otherwise, people will leave the sector, skills will be lost, audiences will suffer, communities will really suffer. And once festivals activities then do start back over the next couple of weeks and months, they will be facing all kinds of new requirements to comply with new regulations, for example, social distancing, for example. So that's all going to create costs for the festival organisations in terms of upskilling, investing in equipment, all of that. So that's adding a further burden to the sector. So the sector is going to need help if it's going to be able to meet those requirements around compliance. I mean, ultimately going forward, I am an optimist because I've been studying festivals for a long time, and I have no doubt that festivals will endure. I mean, I think we have seen the indomitable desire of humans to collectively come together and express their cultural interests, and we've seen it so much over the last few months in the most inventive and creative and really enjoyable ways. We had a recent blog post on our Fest Space website recently from our Barcelona colleague Alba Colombo. She might talk about this a little bit later on. I mean, it's just been fantastic. People have to come together, that's the bottom line, and they will continue to do so, and no crisis will stop them. It will come back. I think technology has been a tremendous enabler. I mean, it's been more than an enabler. It's also been a help in being a producer and a deliverer as well. And it will continue, I think, to change. It will change festival practice, I think, in all levels, from administration, for example, through to, developing work. I think it's become a new presence, a stronger presence. But I don't think that virtual public space will replace physical public space. And this notion of co-presence, I think we're seeing it. We've seen it in those small localized expressions of people all across our cities and towns coming together. People need festivals. I think that's the bottom line. I think as they do start to return then into the more immediate and longer term, I think the initial focus will be on local and domestic audiences. I think there's going to be less emphasis, and I've also got the word less pressure here to produce spectacles, because international tourism is not going to be such an issue. Now, I know this is a problem from one perspective, of course it is a problem, and tourism is going to suffer because festivals as tourist attraction isn't really going to be on the horizon in the immediate future. But there's some good points there as well. There's going to be a greater tendency now to look to smaller, more localized productions, maybe picking up on some of that enthusiasm and that energy that we've seen in those communal gatherings over the last few months. In terms of spatial arrangements, because in our project we're also very interested in how festivals change spaces. I think that the use of space is going to be a bit different in that maybe we're going to see festivals, rather than asking people to come to a place to see a show, they're going to take the show somehow to the place. So maybe we're going to see some more localized productions, maybe connected to some bigger centres, spectacle for sure. But I think it's going to be more grounded, more embedded maybe. I think we might also see festivals change the timing of the delivery, maybe moving productions outside of the traditional festival period. I know some larger, more established festivals, like for example, Galway Arts Festival in Ireland, already co-produce and produce work that they tour. So it's just a question of dealing with all this social distancing and minimizing of numbers. I think, those spatial and temporal changes might become an issue. And, I think there's a lot of positive about this. I think it's a moment for rebalancing that some cities like Edinburgh, for example, like Galway, for example, might welcome. I think the vulnerability of the sector to external shocks has been highlighted hugely. And we don't know how sponsors, for example, are going to react. If they will see festivals and cultural events, as they're going to see it in a new risk sense. And indeed, maybe festivals as tourist attractions might also come to be viewed differently as carrying a greater level of risk than they had done before. So they're not going to be around this year, maybe not next year. So in terms of branding and marketing destinations, tourism bodies might start to think about more other less risky, more year-round offerings, like built attractions or trails, for example. I think we have to think that if COVID-19 is shaking up the festival sector, it's also shaking up other sectors. So we need to see what's going on around us. So, for example, here, there's been a huge rise of interest, it seems, in parks and in the outdoors. And Cuilcha in Ireland, our forestry service, has just introduced the Dublin Mountains Makeover Project, referring to the high recreational demand for the countryside that we've seen in recent months. So there's a lot of things moving, and I think the festival sector just needs to watch what's moving around it. I think going into the future...
Thanks, Bernadette. Sorry.
Can I just make one final point? Have I gone on too long? I think the public...
No,
can I just make one final point? The financial pressures going forward. I think there's a real fear that the festival sector will slip to the bottom of the pile as public finances come under huge pressure, and that will be such a shame. I think this is a political crisis for the sector. I think it has to act now, galvanise itself, to work cross-sectorally and to raise its prospect and fight for the survival of the sector and demonstrate its importance. And I hope it will manage to do that. Thanks.
Thanks, Bernadette. I'm going to quickly move on because we've only got so much time left for so I want to hear from Louisa and then the others before I give you some questions, just to say that we've got a lot of questions coming in on our feed. Thank you.
Thank you. I totally agree with Bernadette, in relation to it's not yet clear how the sector will return and when it will return, and we do need more clarity on what that will look like. And in the meantime, it's really, really important that we continue, to support the sector and ensure that we minimise the casualties from this. I think it's, for me, I think one of the biggest challenges we're going to face is consumer confidence. To attend events and the way we've all become accustomed to it, particularly the sorts of events that we host that do involve mass gatherings, but also for communities to feel safe about hosting events. I think that's something that we need to think about as well, how people feel now about hosting visitors. So the relationship with Visit Scotland is really important, and I think there's brilliant work that's underway about how we, make sure that those safety messages are really clear about people who visit, who attend, about communities who host, and also just about that inspiration, for the domestic market of really encouraging, Scots to rediscover Scotland, and making sure that everything's aligned. I think it's going to be really important moving forward. As Bernadette said, physical distancing, the impact of that on venues, on the structure and atmosphere of festivals, on volume, margins, what that does to costs, where those costs are passed on. These are all things that we really still need time to work through and understand the implications, the impacts it has on event staffing, volunteering opportunities, and also participation. So much of our events and our festivals and our programming is there to enable people who would not normally be able to easily participate. And physical distancing has implications for that, how you particularly for groups who rely on a level of close contact to either be part of the programme or to get the best possible, event experience. And there's still a lot to be worked through, and we can't quite get to that until we're really, really clear about what guidelines are going to be in place for us. There are definitely questions around digital. Can you really replicate that engaged live experience? How do you monetize? And how do artists get the benefit from it as well? Still lots to be thought around that. There are other practical considerations around costs, just the practicalities of future events insurance and higher supplier cancellation charges. All these things that come into the mix that just make events potentially in future more expensive. However, I do want to quickly touch on the positive scale, because I think there are many, and I don't think we should ever underestimate the luxury of being able to pause and listen and rethink. And with that, I think comes huge opportunity. How do we work more collaboratively as an industry, make more room for each other and new entrants, support some of the smaller festivals? Can you combine programming? It's a chance for us to really rethink local and national programmes, and does everything have to happen each year, and does it always have to be in such a large scale? We've been quite traditional in Paisley around that. And it's not going to be able to be at that scale for a while, so in that really does lie the opportunity. There is the challenge of responding to the new rules of engagement, but I think we've seen the industry starting to adapt already, which is hugely positive, and a real opportunity for local productions, local events, and currently in Redshire we're undergoing a multi-million pounds investment in our venues and outdoor spaces. So there's a real opportunity to, as that develops, to link so much more closely with our cultural regeneration and what the shape of events are going to be in future. So,
okay.
And just finally, I want to say, I think it is going to come down to a combination of real innovation and creativity locally, and how we nourish the local sector, but actually how we work much more collegiately at a national level and not compete for the event space. Okay,
thanks, Louisa. Just moving on briefly to Lindsay and then to Mary as well. Just taking it maybe from that local perspective to a national perspective then, Lindsay, and internationally for the scale that you work on. Do you want to add a comment to that?
Yeah, and I think it's quite reassuring to see the passion of our colleagues who have so much to say about what the future might bring, whether it's good and bad. I think that these debates are going to go on. I think we have to remember that our culture and our artists are going to play a very critical role in recording this period of history. We need to ensure that history records not just official records and media and endless public inquiries, but the actual stories of the people who've lived through this and who emerge from it with a changed worldview, and who feel differently about the way society is structured, and who feel differently about how they engage with each other and with culture. But more broadly, and in an attempt to move things forward and not end up having the same conversation again, I think, practically speaking, the future, there's lots of concerns about that supply chain and where that work is coming from. The Fringe is an international festival, but it is also a Scottish festival and a UK festival. Almost all of the work comes from the islands of the UK. What investment is going to be needed to build that long-term picture? The Arts Council Chief Executive this morning, Darren Henley, was saying they're planning for a 4-year recovery period. I'd echo that I'm worried that the work that we've put into making our events accessible and affordable is going to end up being put by the wayside, when actually we need to work even harder than we ever have to make sure that everybody can participate, and that there isn't a need, particularly when you get to an event of our scale, to do away with any of that nuance and to operate on purely commercial economic terms, because I don't think that's very helpful to us all. We work with partners to make sure that we're talking to the right people. I think the thing we need to really hold on to is ensuring that the culture that does survive, because I think it's naive of us to think that some of our cultural organisations will not survive. You know what I mean? To ensure that the culture that does survive isn't homogenous, that it reflects the society that we live in, it reflects our people, it reflects our communities. More positively, I think there's going to be, I would 100% echo this notion that there's going to be a focus on place. we can expect that our audiences are going to be local and domestic for a few years. Actually, only 7 or 8% of the Fringe's audience is international. We're already operating in that very local and domestic market. But this is a chance for us to re-engage with some of those narratives. You know, as Bernadette alluded to, you can hear narrative after narrative that the Fringe isn't for the residents of Edinburgh, but our postcode data alone from ticket sales tells us that's not true. You know, they are our largest audience base and they love the festival, but it does tell us there's work to do here and an opportunity that we didn't ask for, but it is now open to us because we have some time to re-engage those conversations, to have a different narrative with our city and its citizens about the role that the city plays in being uniquely Edinburgh, and the Fringe is a unique entity within that, and how the two are symbiotic and should work together, and that we could do things differently, and now we have the time to have the conversation. And I think we can all take the opportunity to consider what we can do to offer the best events. And remember that ultimately we choose festivals because they're a celebration, and there will come a point when we're past this where celebration will be necessary and cathartic, and we'll need to come together to laugh and cry and refactor the future. So I'm quite excited about the future, but I would just like this bit to be over with sooner rather than later.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that echoes much of what's come through about the place and space being important, and the sense of identity and togetherness, and as you say, to love, to live, to laugh. Mari, do you want to finish us off with a comment for that before I just give a couple of questions that are all coming in? Thanks.
Sure. Yes, you know, the question is, what are the implications? And that's what we're all working really hard together to try and, you know, get some clarity around. There's a lot of work underway to inform a joined up recovery strategy for the sector. And it's great that so many, in terms of the work we've been undertaking for the past few weeks, we've had about 21 forums involving colleagues from across the events and festival sector, sport, culture, venues, public sector, etc. There's a report actually on Event Scotland's LinkedIn and on visitscotland.org. I'll not go through everything that came out of that, but for those of you that haven't had a chance to have a look at that yet, it identifies some of the sort of key priorities and issues, and then, you know, what the implications are right now. And we have, as a response, put a number of work streams in place to address some of these issues and take that forward. But I think just more broadly, without going into the detail of all of that, people can have a look at that for themselves. I'd agree with everything everybody was saying, but I would also add to, you know, there's implications for audiences, clearly, in terms of the focus for our audiences. There's implications for form, for viability, for support and survival. But I would add reputation to that. You know, Scotland is recognised worldwide as the perfect stage for events, and Edinburgh is recognised as our world festival city. But we, you know, these are our international calling card, and they are part of our brand and reputation. We mustn't move too quickly and get this wrong. We need to ensure that the next steps to get up and running reflect our world-class reputation that we've built, and our international reputation is at stake. You know, if we lose it, it will be difficult to rebuild again. So we have to remember that we have to take our time, you know, and make sure that we get this right, because there is a lot at stake. And then I guess the final point for me, you know, we've been saying throughout, it's the need to have voice in all of this. What are the implications? The implications are we need a strong, coordinated voice to inform and shape a sustainable recovery plan that's important for our sector. So again, you know, I'd encourage everyone to, if you don't already sign up to the eventscotland.org bulletins, make sure you're involved in that conversation moving forward, because we certainly don't want to leave anyone out of that.
A good plug for the sector there. Well done, Mari. There's a lot of interesting questions coming through, and I think it's really key that the way that all of you are talking about this link back to this exchange of what we talk about as international public culture. And I referred to right at the beginning that we've witnessed right from things like the Great Expos in 1851, where we had no digital and people sailed for 6 months of the year to stage an expo, and we exchanged trade and industry, and very often talked about that none of that could have happened successfully without entertainment, without culture, without learning from each other's culture. We see our travelling community exchange culture through storytelling across countries, across boundaries, festivals and events are supposed to break down some of these boundaries. And some of these questions that we're coming on are talking about the language and the themes that we're using, and how we build confidence in the sector, how we take leadership to build that confidence back. And I'm thinking from, Lindsay, your festival represents that. It is a Scottish audience, but and that's not been come across enough, yet we have this international exchange of culture as well. And I think, just that point and that question of, do you think this does give us a time and scope to say, what was our vision that we were wanting to do? Yes, this is part of our soft power as a nation, our cultural diplomacy, where we exchange the cultures and values. How are we able to continue to do that? And some of the points we made here are also about, for the small people in this, the artists, the creatives that are being hailed as visionary during COVID, but actually are overtaken sometimes by the large events and festival sector. Lindsay, over to you for that one. That was like a multiple question.
Yeah, I think from the Fringe's point of view, it's quite important to remember that the Fringe Society, the organisation I work for, it's not our festival. The festival is made up of, hundreds, if not thousands, of individual constituent parts, and I think that's the reason why it will thrive in the long term, because while there's a space in the Fringe for every type of festival you can think of. If you want an international exchange and international showcasing of work, then that's available, as much as American high school theatre groups coming and producing their largely amateur work. There was a lot of questions in there. I think the reality is that what we have is a space in which to reset some of the perceived imbalance, and it's largely an economic imbalance. And I think everybody's going to be broke for a while, and actually that is the great leveler in many ways. And we're certainly going to continue to ensure that the case for not just the Fringe Society's survival, we're only a very small part of that wider picture. But for the wider festival constituent base, which is largely UK. And, we'll continue our international engagement with industry and media, particularly that international industry is a huge element of what is successful about the Fringe. It's a very unique thing to our festival. And it really, the Fringe is uniquely representing Scotland and the wider UK in that international space. And I think that, we're exploring how we make sure that can happen this year, and then how we can make sure that actually going forward, you don't need to be in Edinburgh to have a meaningful engagement with that for an international delegate. So I think our job over the next wee while is to just talk to people and have conversations, and then spend the time to make sure that we're thinking through not just the survival period, but starting to think strategically about a more long-term picture. And I don't think I answered any of your questions directly there.
No, you did. There's a lot of stuff coming in. Thank you. We've got room for one more person to answer a part of that question. Has anybody got a burning desire to jump in? Mary?
I think if I understood the question correctly, are we keeping international connections alive? I think is what you were asking us. And I think certainly from where I'm sitting, that's very much on the go. And we're all sitting here, we're all over the place having this conversation. People from all over the world are joining us in this. And from where I'm sitting, these conversations with international partners and contacts are still going on. We're trying to work out how this new situation, how we can still facilitate these connections, how we can create new work, but also when we get back to a near normal situation, if that ever happens again, what's that going to look like? So I wouldn't say it's not stopped. It continues. But and as we've only been in this for 10 or 11 weeks, and things are already developing at such a huge pace. I don't have any concerns that there'll be a lack of international collaboration. It'll be done in different ways.
Thank you very much to all of you. We're going to wrap up there. We've had lots of really interesting comments, and I'm sure you'll be able to go and look at them as well on the live feeds. We're going to be summarising them and coming back to you over the next couple of weeks for people with an output from that as well. We're going to move now and take a break and ask you wonderful people to leave, and we'll get our next lot of speakers in and invite David to come and share the next session on sport events. Feel free to watch on one of the channels if you're interested. And thank you very much again for participating. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
2, 1, 0. Okay, hello and welcome back to the next session of the conference this afternoon. This session is going to be chaired with myself, Professor David McGilvery from the School of Business and Creative Industries at UWS, and the focal point is on COVID-19 and the future of sport events. So welcome to those that have joined us who are particularly interested in this session, and good to see those that have continued from the previous session also with us. We have 3 speakers in this session, which hopefully gives us a little bit more time to discuss. And these speakers are, in order, first we'll have Dr. Laura Meisner, who's Associate Professor in the School of Kinesiology at Western University in London, Ontario in Canada. And her research focused on how sport and sport events can be used as instruments of social change, with maybe a specific emphasis on how sport for persons with a disability can positively impact community accessibility. We've also got David Grevenberg, who's going to be joining us, who is the Chief Executive of the Commonwealth Games Federation, the organisation that has responsibility for the Commonwealth Games, Commonwealth Youth Games and other initiatives. And David was, of course, also the Chief Executive of the Organising Committee of Glasgow 2014 Commonwealth Games. And finally, we have Professor Martin Muller, who's currently the Swiss National Science Foundation Professor in the Department of Geography and Sustainability at the University of Lausanne, Switzerland. And Martin's done a lot of work on mega events such as the Olympic Games, Football World Cup and Expos. So we're going to firstly start, and it's following the same structure to the previous session with 2 main questions. And I'm going to post the first question to Laura. And the first question is, Laura, what are the effects economically, socially and culturally of COVID-19 on the landscape of small, major and mega sporting events?
Thank you. And thank you, David and Gail, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So good morning for me anyway. I'm going to talk a little bit about medium and small scale event impacts, because I know my 2 other commentators today are going to talk a little bit more about the large scale and the mega event landscape. And a lot of my comments to begin with map on well to the previous session around events and the impact on communities, on potential tourism impacts, and the missed opportunities that we have for building community and that salubrious socialization that comes on along with events. But I think there are some other impacts that we have to think broadly about for some of those communities. Many of the smaller medium events are hosted in smaller communities where there aren't necessarily other opportunities. So when we're talking about large scale events, Olympic, Paralympic Games, Commonwealth Games, they tend to be in cities that have other strategies that come alongside them in terms of tourism and economic development. But many of the smaller scale events are held in communities where events really become the anchor for their development opportunities. And so there are a few other strategies that are implemented. And so many of these communities are really seeing a huge gap. And what's happening is we're seeing a significant knock-on effect from when large scale events like the Olympic Games are canceled, that then those smaller events that would have gone along, could have happened in advance of those games. So the trial events, the test events, all of those things that would happen in some of the smaller communities, those are being lost as well. And so those have significant, not only economic and tourism impacts for the region, but a significant impact on the community in terms of social capital development. So the bringing together of people in and around events in that community, because there aren't those other opportunities. And what we're seeing in Canada is also a really significant knock-on effect. And this is something unique to this sector in terms of sport and sport development. So in Canada, where I am, the sport development sector relies heavily on events, on all different sizes and scales of events in terms of the model of funding. So sport organizations from the top all the way to our community organizations receive a model of funding from our government that is based on success at events. So athletes are successful at an event, and therefore that increases the opportunity to access funding initiatives from our governments. And so the sport organizations are able to do more. That in and of itself might be a problematic model, and we could talk a lot about that model, but that's a current model that's held in many countries around the world. And so now we've thrown everything into disarray by the fact that we don't have these these performance measures in order to be thinking about how sport organizations are going to function. And that has a significant impact on sport development across the board. So from high performance athletes being moved out and not being able to train, not being able to access the resources that they would normally be accessing through coaches and their high performance services, but all the way down through the system to many of us are sitting at home with our kids here and not involved in their regular sporting activities. So the cancellation or the postponement of many of these, even small scale events, then does have a significant impact on the sport development system throughout, from an economic perspective, but also from a general sport development perspective. So how are we going to think about getting athletes, youth back into the system and ready and prepared for what those next steps might look like? And I think about some of the events in Canada that we've seen more recently been canceled. And these are canceled. These are not events that are being postponed. These are not events that we're trying to hold again later. Things like the Arctic Winter Games. So very unique type of event that's bringing communities in the far north together, where these communities are very disparate, very far apart, geographically far apart, socially far apart, and there is no real opportunity otherwise to bring them together. So there isn't a chance for those communities to connect. And so when you cancel something like the Arctic Winter Games, which were canceled, they were to be held in the Yukon in March. Those were canceled. That has a significant impact for those communities from a social development perspective, a community perspective, and an opportunity for participation, because the athletes that participate in those events have few and far between opportunities to be participating. We're also seeing that in terms of some of the rural events where there might be something that would have gone on in terms of a tournament or a small event that brought the community together, and those aren't happening. And the last thing before I turn it over to my colleagues, who I know are going to talk a lot more about the large scale events, I think one of the things that we're seeing in an interesting impact is in terms of events that are sport participation events, so participatory events. So I'm sure many of you, and I know David's one of them, would be participating in some of your things like your park runs or perhaps your marathons or other events. The impact of these being canceled, of course, have an impact on us as individuals and our health and our lifestyle, but they also have a significant impact on community and nonprofit organizations. Most of these events are run as charity events, right? You run a marathon and you're running that marathon raising funds for a charity or a community organization. And with the cancellation of most of those throughout the summer, and here many of them throughout the fall already have been canceled, that's having a significant impact on those community and the charity organizations that would normally be using that event, that participatory event, as a driver of their development. And I think about things like the Toronto Marathon, which would have happened already around the Bay in Toronto, or around the Bay in Hamilton, which is another large-scale event raising funds for breast cancer research. So many of those events have been canceled, and those will have a significant impact on those charity organizations and community organizations. And I know that one of the things that was brought up in our previous discussion within the context of some of those ideas was also the differential impact for marginalized groups. And I think this is an example where we're going to see this to be this exacerbated when we talk about things like the charity opportunities, the return to sport being potentially marginalized for para-athletes, women, where there isn't necessarily the same level of access. So I think the impacts are so far reaching, we could go on and on about it, but I thought those was encapsulate some of the things that we might not hear from our large scale event perspectives. So thank you.
Fantastic, Laura. A really great start, and lots of issues there that I'm sure will generate additional questions and commentary as we get into discussion. David has joined us, David Grevenberg. I think, are you there, David? Yes, camera on. So David, we're gonna hand over to you next, just to respond to that kind of initial question, which I set out, which was the effects economically, socially and culturally of COVID on the landscape of small, major and mega sport events. And obviously you're giving us a response from the perspective of the Commonwealth Games Federation and the Commonwealth Games. So I'll hand over to you, David.
Well, first of all, thank you. It's good to be here, and I hope everyone is safe and well. It's been really interesting. We've been an organization by our geography, our our demographics, our shared history, and I would say some of our shared ambition that is accustomed to working remotely. So, where many of us are on the road traveling. So this is, I think, the first time I've been grounded since high school. But it certainly has, from just a federational standpoint, I think has allowed us to really throttle back and has given us a little bit of time to focus on some of the probably necessary strategic thinking that sometimes we don't typically have, which I dare say is now perpetuating into how can we not only recover but actually reset some of the work that we're doing and how we approach some of the work. I think it also has given people more courage to recognize that the digital sphere, in terms of digital connectivity, digital awareness, and the use of digital forms can be an enormous enhancement, cost saver, environment saver to the standard work of a federation. So I think from that standpoint, economically, socially, getting that balance right, one can argue that there's nothing like in-person contact. But I think just from running a business, we certainly, and a global business at that, from the comfort of my office home, has been certainly a worthwhile experience, in the sense that I think it'll help us work smarter. When it comes to running the games and the impact, and I think I need to share with some of the points that Alexandra has put out there, is that we have certainly, I think, seen a shift, and I think there'll be a lot of question in terms of, have we reached a critical mass in sport, and will we end up consolidating? And in that consolidation, will our events take a different format? Will the size and complexity of our events be forced to reduce or work differently? Will we have to innovate in order to reach audiences? I mean, what we essentially have seen in so many rights negotiations and selling our properties, is that we create through, whether it's the digital sphere or the broadcast sphere, or even in the ticket sphere, those that in-stadium feel, which I think it will dramatically change, and so that will have an enormous impact on how we are going to innovate. And then inevitably, we're going to need to consolidate. And what we're seeing right now is that, first and foremost, we have a duty of care. And this is a word that I probably didn't understand it as well as I do now, until I had the responsibility as a chief executive for an organizing committee and had a duty of care for 46,000 people under my duty of care. And that focuses the minds, not only because if you're negligent, you'll get thrown in jail, but also just for the fact that you have an enormous responsibility of looking after people. I think what the pandemic has done is really has started new conversations on our duty of care, the impact that has on force majeure clauses, the impact that has on indemnity and liability clauses, and how you can actually ensure a facility, a program, an activity robustly and effectively. And I think that is going to have a knock-on effect to community programs, to major sporting events, and how we are allowed, and the tolerance of risk. I'm looking at the case study of the UFC in Jacksonville as a fascinating case study. How did they actually pull that off in this current situation beyond the politics? Did they uphold their duty of care? And then beyond that is how do you actually create meaningful experiences that truly live to the promise of creating people's proudest moments. And what we are in the business of doing in the world of sport is creating people's proudest moments. So essentially what we've had to do, and I'll summarize here or finalize here, what we have had to do as a federation, and this has allowed us to accelerate some of these conversations, is actually show the value proposition, our unique value proposition, as well as our sense of responsibility and accountability for the games that we deliver, the programs that we run, and the decisions that we make. And we've been able to do that consistently. We're getting traction, and you'd be surprised, on the potential host in Hamilton right now in Southern Ontario, because of the approach that we're taking, values-based, people-centered, and impact-focused, aligned to our vision, aligned to our track record of hosting events that have had a positive impact on communities. And we had a report that was published. We just published it into the public domain, and I can circulate it or direct you to it. That through PricewaterhouseCoopers has shown that our games don't only provide economic impact, but positive social impact consistently because of the approach that we've taken. What the pandemic has allowed us to do is to recognize that and really use that in such a way that it helps us speak to our convictions, but also to the value that we add. And I think that that's going to be essential and for all sport federations, big and small, single sport, multi-sport, as they come out or as they deal with the new norm or the resets that will occur, their sense of responsibility and accountability to the communities and the people that they ultimately serve. So that's how, I mean, socially, economically, and I would guess strategically, we are adapting to this current and for the immediate forecast, the situation at hand, and creating new opportunities. And final point, we also announced a partnership with the Global Esport Federation, which is really looking at digital connectivity and the various genres of esport and society, and how we can maybe cross the divide as being a contributor through this new digital sphere, using the power of sport in a new and different way, not your traditional esport way, as you would say, but a way that we can add as a movement our unique touch to digital connectivity, digital infrastructure enhancement, e-commerce, across a number of the constituent bodies we serve. And 2/3 of the world's small island states. We have 1/3 of the world's population in the Commonwealth, and 10 of the top 20 emerging cities in terms of urban sustainability issues and so forth. And a lot of the commonality in all of that is the digital sphere right now. So So anyway, it's
great, and there's lots to come back on. I'm sure we'll open this up in discussion. Certainly in my home, there's a lot of esports being played, so esports may well be a future. So I'm going to hand over finally in this first part to Martin, and again addressing the same question, Martin. So if you could take us away.
Absolutely. So I'm sitting here in Lausanne, and the International Olympic Committee's headquarters is just 5 minutes down the road. So that's what I'll be talking about mostly. It's the Olympic Games, because this is the event that I know best. And I think in the current time, there's a quote by Warren Buffett that I find quite pertinent. Warren Buffett said, when the tide is going out, you see who's been swimming naked. And I think that's pretty apt for the current situation, especially for sports events, because sports events create a majority of the income within a very short time span. And so they are particularly vulnerable to situations where the tide is going out unexpectedly, where all of a sudden you find yourself in low water, in no water at all. That's true for the International Olympic Committee, whose income is generated by two big events, basically, the Summer Olympic Games for the largest part of the income and the Winter Olympic Games for a smaller one. And so the International Olympic Committee has actually been preparing for a situation like this. I don't think they thought it particularly likely that this was going to happen. Nobody did, I think. We were all underprepared. But because they knew that so much of their income depended on this one event, they did build the financial reserves to be able to weather a cancellation of the Olympic Games. It's not been cancelled. It's been postponed by a year, which seems like a pretty straightforward solution, except that there are, of course, many problems that come with this postponement. The first of this is simply nobody knows whether we'll be able to hold Olympic Games in a year's time. We'll only be able to do this if there's a vaccine, and if that vaccine has been widely deployed and has been widely accessible. So one might well be in a situation where the Olympic Games don't go ahead as usual. One might well be in a situation where they have to go ahead without spectators. But the key thing here is uncertainty now and still in 6 months' time, I think, which is a key dynamic around the Olympic Games in 2021. Uncertainty also still financial uncertainty. There are cost estimates of between $3 and $6 billion US dollars in addition to keep the games preparation running for one more year in Tokyo for the Tokyo Games. And that there, of course, there's sponsorship money and broadcasting money that is not coming in at the moment, partly because sponsors are saying, look, if the games are not happening, we don't get any benefit, why should we pay? Partly because sponsors are in financial trouble themselves, like Airbnb, which is a major sponsor of the Olympic Games, who has just laid off a large portion of their staff, or Toyota, which is embroiled in the general crisis of car manufacturing around the world. So there are elements of delayed payments coming in particular with sponsors being uncertain whether the games are going to go ahead at all, even with a postponement to next year. So this is the economic element. There's a sports element as well, in the sense that, of course, you can postpone the Olympic Games by a year, but the schedule wasn't empty for summer 2021. So if a heavyweight like the Olympic Games comes crashing in, of course, it leaves in its wake a whole host of other smaller events that thought they were safe in 2021 because there was no big events scheduled. And all of a sudden, they find themselves competing with Olympic Games for attention, sometimes for athletes. So this is far from straightforward. And then finally, I think there's a social and emotional impact. And the key question there is, will it ever be the same sitting in a stadium with 40,000 other people? Will that feeling ever be the same? Because up to now, for many people, this was kind of the high point, or the point of ecstasy, if you like, of excitement, of enthusiasm, shared through being in a crowd with many people, close to many other people, because it's this proximity, actually, that allows emotions and affect to really boil over. There are architects of stadia that have compared stadia to a witch's cauldron, which I think is a quite fit example for the kind of effective dynamics that happen. All of a sudden, we're talking about the complete opposite. We are talking about social distancing, which is not at all conducive to atmospheres in the stadium. So the question is, even if you have the Olympic Games in 2021, even if you have many people sitting in a stadium, will they sit there with enthusiasm and excitement, or with some trepidation or fear, or at least some kind of reserve that they have, or misgivings about being there, about taking a certain risk? So these, for me, would be the major elements of the current situation.
That's great, Martin. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of kind of commonality around about the responses that we've had. We're going to ask a second question, but just in this period, once you've all had the chance to speak, I thought we'd just draw attention to some issues coming through in terms of the questions. I think you just touched on it at the end there, Martin, but maybe for David and Laura, the context of sort of atmosphere, liminality that comes from the experience of being in the city and enjoying a large sport event. How do we address that, or how do you as our event organizer address that, David? And from Laura, what can you do to make that feel like an experience that people will enjoy, but also, I guess, pay for at some level?
Laura, do you want to take it first, or you want me?
I'll just say a few things, and I'll be interested to see what you have to say about it, David. I think as an interesting piece, I have seen it floating around a bit. But if you haven't seen it, there's a great historical photo from 1918 of a football match in the UK during that time of extreme crisis, and all the fans sitting in the stands with masks on. So, we think about this time being something so new. It's new for what we know in our current lifetime, but sport has survived a lot beyond what this current time is. It just looks different now, and so I think there's lots of ways that we can think about reinventing those opportunities. And one of the things that I would say, and then perhaps this is something that David can touch upon, is that often what we've seen in terms of the development of large scale events is that they're a top-down approach to thinking about building community, building engagement, building spectatorship, all of those things. And this might be a time for community to guide us, to guide the event sector in how they want those events to be set up, managed, and positively impact those communities. And I think some of the work that's being done with Commonwealth Games is a great example of where the community is driving some of those things. And that might help us understand a bit more about how people might return to the stadium, return to be fans, engage, but maybe in new and different ways. So maybe it's not so much about us making the decision for them, but that spectators, fans, sport fanatics telling us this is the ways in which we might be willing to re-engage at different paces and in different ways. And so I think we need to find those spaces of liminality that allow for that type of engagement. So it's a little bit of a bottom-up approach, and that might be a bit of a change for some of our big organizers, but I think it's a real opportunity for us.
Yeah, thank you. David?
Yeah, I think to kind of carry on that theme, I think certainly, I mentioned duty of care. We have an obligation, first and foremost, to create a harm-free environment, and that goes without saying. I think respecting and protecting people, that if we don't do that and we start to create, we start to promote and empower, we've actually missed the plot from the beginning. So. That in this current situation, whilst your sporting event or a major event may feel and look different, it's going to be up to us in terms of creating stylistically and the sincerity of the proposition that still has a communal feel. And I think the meaning behind the event, I think we were emerging, through second screen technology and the whole impact of social media at live events, how that plays into the use of these wonderful devices. I actually think, again, will start to take on a new form, and I think that it will cause us to create less of this kind of hierarchical, exclusive approach, which many of our commercial models have been built on and so forth, and much more of an egalitarian. There's a wonderful word, and go explore this after this summit or session. Adhocracy. I think forcing us to look at things in more of an adhocracy, innovative, risk-taking way with communities, and I think that is it. It's actually, we have the chance now to become better informed and better connected if we allow ourselves. And I think this really COVID has put down a marker on the world of sport. And I really, I have to say to to Martin, I love the Warren Buffett quote. I think you're absolutely, many sport federations are in very uncomfortable territory right now. And I think what we need to be respecting, listening, and learning more than ever to be able to adapt our events to be world class, but also community relevant in this new world. And that's just I think it's going to be very, very hard to go back to I would say the old way of thinking, knowing what we know now and experiencing what we've experienced to such an extent. And yeah, I mean, I think that's how I would I'd say we're probably approaching this.
Yeah, excellent. Martin, do you want to come back on that kind of notion of kind of atmosphere, liminality, the kind of nature of these experiences?
Sure. Well, I think this is the key notion, really, that drives events, big or small, and sports or other events, really. And I think this is a challenge if you talk about digitalizing. This is simply the challenge that we'll face, because we know that now talking via Google Meet like this in a distantiated way creates very different dynamics, because we don't get certain cues that we would otherwise get, because we only see people's faces, we don't see their body language very much, and so I mean it's just a different thing even if you have your home cinema to watch in your home cinema a sports event than to be there. But then I think I would definitely join what Laura says, that events in the past have been organized in a different way. And perhaps corresponding, Laura, to the image you mentioned, is an image that here in Switzerland is quite interesting. In 1948, just after the Second World War, Switzerland organized the Winter Olympic Games. And there's an interesting image where the opening ceremony is a couple of people standing around a lake, and a couple of athletes marching on that lake with a few flags. And so we just need to remind ourselves that, yes, I mean, sports events are still possible at a much smaller scale. Yes, of course, we've become accustomed to revenue streams, and people are employed on those revenue streams. So it might be very difficult to change that model. But we do have the technology also to keep some of those revenue streams, but still make those events smaller, make them less complex, make them less burdensome on the local economy. And I think this is what the Tokyo organizers basically said in a recent interview that I read, is they said, look, we are not going to put all the money into this in order to deliver the same high standard we had prepared for 2020. We will concentrate on the must-haves. We will go back to the essentials and the basics. And I think that's a message that might carry on very nicely to subsequent Olympic Games in Paris and Los Angeles, who might actually find that, yes, it's possible to do it without the bells and whistles, but still have a great event. And you just need a precedent to demonstrate. And in that sense, the COVID epidemic really gives us pause for thinking and for reflecting on some things we've taken for granted.
Great, thank you very much. We've got about 20 minutes left, so I'm aware we have a sort of second question that I asked you to contemplate, which was about what future changes. Now, we've touched a little bit on those, but what future changes we see to the sport event kind of marketplace once maybe the worst kind of features of COVID have passed. So we go to Laura first, just to give us a response on that. We have got some questions coming in, so I want to leave 5 minutes at the end if we can to get to those. So Laura, maybe you want to give us a little piece on that.
Sure. And to be fair, I'm not sure I have a lot to say about this, because I think this is something that is evolving, and it's evolving rapidly. I mean, in my role, I'm an academic, but I'm also an administrator at the university. And so I feel like I make a decision 1 hour and the next it's changed, because the change, it is evolving so rapidly. So I'm not sure that we know yet. So there's some things that I've been thinking more about from a cautionary note. Obviously, my research really focuses on inclusion and equity, and I'm quite keenly interested in how we will return to an event landscape that really is attentive to and values avenues, equity and inclusion, and is that possible? And we certainly know from the current pandemic that this pandemic affects people quite differently. And I was just reading an article yesterday from our federal government that is actually doing an investigation on the impact of COVID-19 on women, because we know that the impact is quite gendered. We know that the rate of loss of work, particularly part-time work, which does encompass the sport, tourism, and events sector, has been predominantly women. And so they're talking about the notion of she-covery, the idea that finding ways that we actually create more equitable ways to be inclusive. And I also think about that in terms of parasport and athletes with disability. I work intimately with athletes with disability, and we have an ongoing project looking at some of those impacts on these athletes. And so I think it's really important that we start to think about, in any recovery process, in any reinvention process, how we create those opportunities for equity. So I'm not sure I have an answer other than to say, I think we need to think about it a little bit differently and to be cautious. My big concern is that we jump right back in to where we were and think that it's going to be okay. And those that will be losing out are those that have always been marginalized, will be marginalized even further. So I think it's going to be a real challenge. And I applaud, David's agenda from the Commonwealth Games. I think it's a pretty lofty one. But perhaps there is some learnings and some things that we can be thinking about in the way we consider our reentry to events, being more community-based, more focused on equity and inclusion. How about an athlete focus? I think we've come to a point, and Martin's pointed that out, we're talking about spectacles at the large-scale events. We're not talking about athlete-focused events. I think in the decisions that were made so many times around whether an event was canceled for a large-scale event, it wasn't about an athlete. It wasn't about the impact on the athlete. It was about the money and the TV rights and the sponsors. But wouldn't it be nice if we return to an event landscape that when we talk about a sport event, we talk about athletes first and the rise of that. And so I think that's going to be a real challenge for the sector. But perhaps, I'm trying to be optimistic about it, an exciting time for the sector as well.
Thank you, Laura. I think I'm going to hand the baton literally to you, David, on that, because there's some interesting things in there that clearly you're having to deal with as an event owner at the moment. And I think that inclusion, that equity, that human rights dimension is so crucial, because it was becoming more important, but now we have a crisis. Does it become more important, or actually is there a kind of pull back from that kind of commitment? So
I think actually to Laura's point, EDI, equality, diversity, inclusion is more important now than ever. It's one, so we don't lose the plot. Two, so that we can bring as many people with us during this journey as possible. And I think the local community and the virtual community are going to become incredibly important in how they intersect. I think one of the things that we are really, really looking at right now, the Commonwealth and what is our unique value proposition? We're not just another competing event. What is the unique value proposition of who we are and what we represent? Our geography, our shared history, our demographic, and some of the ambitions and ideals that we seek to uphold make us who we are. And we think that what we're essentially doing is playing to our strengths as a value-added contributor, not only to the Commonwealth, but as a best case example or a case study for major sport events, the world, the intersection between peace, sustainability, and prosperity and sport. And so we've been writing this narrative, some by not necessity, but also I think now by a sense of shared purpose and conviction and shared value that's been generated across 72 nations and territories, who once referred to themselves as the British Commonwealth, now referring to themselves as the Global Commonwealth, is a very big distinct difference. And that solidarity during a time like this, and as we recalibrate going forward, we are being able to maintain momentum and a culture of, I would say, real aspiration and ambition and kindness that I really think that is going to help us endure. And I think that our major sporting event, the flexibility, the agility, the willingness to find solutions because of some of the groundwork we've done over the past 7 years to really have open, frank, and transparent conversations on some of these areas and embrace our diversity. I mean, I can tell you right now, you know, women are leading the way in so many ways. I have a board, I have a female president, and one of the few in the world of sport, and a board that is 48% represented by women on a board, which is extraordinary in most sport contexts. I can tell you that diversity and thought and perspective and so forth is really pushing us forward. So I think, you know, I couldn't agree more with Laura that EDI is something we're going to need to keep very close to in terms of the way we protect the diversity, but also in how we use it and embrace it to our advantage. And I think right now, the traditional patriarchal hierarchies of the world are crumbling because they don't respond well to collaborative working. You work, you know, you cascade down and you manage up, and that's the way we've all been taught. What's happening now is how do we get into, you know, groups that work and solve problems, and then move on to the next challenge or the next opportunity. And I think that is much more conducive to the way sport is having to respond to this current situation.
Great, really interesting. I'm just going to, we have time to hand over to Martin just to talk about that future question, and then I'm going to pose a couple of questions that we can ask of you all just before we close. Martin.
Sure. So it's funny, last year I started working on an idea that I called peak event. And the idea of peak event being that we are reaching or have reached the high point of global mega events. And I'm only talking about mega events here. I'm thinking of the Olympic Games, the Football World Cup in particular. And last year I thought, well, that looks pretty speculative, but there was some good evidence around actually that we might be reaching peak event. There was the legitimation crisis of the Olympic Games and the Football World Cup, legitimation around human rights violation, around the cost-benefit ratio being very bad or dismal proposed by the Olympic Games and the Football World Cup. And there was a climate crisis and the climate protests going on, and no real meaningful action or way of addressing this by the Olympic movement, where mega events are a relatively carbon-intensive undertaking. And so I started work on that concept, and along comes this pandemic. And all of a sudden, it does seem to resonate much more also with what everybody is thinking, which is kind of putting the questions to themselves. Is this a way we can go forward, or we want to go forward? And so what I would like to say is COVID-19 is not the only crisis or not the only question, difficult question that is being asked of big events at the moment. So there is a concatenation of different challenging elements for the Olympic Games that has led to a decline in interest of bidding for the Games, and to the International Olympic Committee becoming more flexible in terms of what it asks from hosts from Games organizers. And I think for peak event, I think in a way it's encouraging to be at peak event in the sense that, as David Groenberg said before, maybe there's a consolidation phase in which some organizations need to ask very hard questions of themselves, of what the values are, of whether they've always put the athletes first, whether they are actually sustainable as an event in the long run. And that's referring to one question that I saw posted by Alexandra Oranka. Hello, Alexandra. Whether this crisis is going to lead to more sustainability. Well, I do hope so. I do hope so. And I think for me that there are really three dynamics that need to happen. We've talked about digitalization. This is the first one that needs to be explored, which climate-wise is certainly a smart step. The other one is downsizing, which I think is going to happen inevitably as a response to COVID and the financial difficulties that the Tokyo organizers also mentioned, where you need to concentrate on what is essential and cut away the bells and whistles. And the other thing is thinking of, I'm a geographer by training, is thinking about dispersing those events. by not only hosting them in one city, but thinking more strategically about where the infrastructures are and spreading them out to other places, which would also make the after use of venues, of everything you build for those events, much more sustainable and spread any kind of benefit by avoiding white elephant in terms of over really large infrastructures. So these, for me, would be ways I would see this crisis leading, actually, perhaps being quite healthy in the long run, leading towards more sustainable approaches to hosting big events.
That's fabulous, Martin. Okay, so that's been really fascinating in terms of the links between you all. We have plenty of questions coming in, so we've got about 4 or 5 minutes left, so I'm just going to ask those questions. So there was actually one that I'll maybe ask Laura and David to talk about, which was that sustainability. So it was great that Martin answered the question that came in, which has shown our interactivity. But there's maybe for David and Laura, the question was, do we imagine that there will be more sustainable mega events, or will there actually be a kind of emphasis on more monopolization that comes after this particularly serious stage of the COVID pandemic passes? David or Laura? David, your mic's on, so you can give us a...
Okay. Sorry, Laura. Yeah, I think it's a great question. If you look at where events are hosted, events are hosted in places, and you've got those markets that are typically emerging markets, more sustained markets, or regenerative markets. We've typically rationalized hosting events in one of those 3 types of markets. My question now is, that has largely been focused on economic emergence, economic sustainability, and economic regeneration. If we are now going to put an equal balance on social sustainability, social emergence, and social, has sport equipped itself well enough, and are our events compelling enough, manageable enough to leverage where the potential investment is going to come from those? So, largely sport has measured its success on the cost and pricing of rights. I think we're going to see a huge shift on return on investment in a much more sustainable development and holistic approach. So how does your event contribute to the SDGs? How does your event provide, yes, economic, but also the social and the environmental? And at the same time, if you subscribe to the OECD's well-being framework, that prosperity is no longer just the notion of economic prosperity, but the sense of well-being. And so I think that sport is now going to have to become much more evidence-based in its proposition. It's going to be more methodical in delivering its events, and not allowing things to just happen either by accident. It's going to have to be, considered deliberate impact. And you're only as credible as you are legitimate. So legitimacy over time equals credibility. And so it's a track record. And what we've essentially done, recently with our report for our games, which is one of our properties, is started to tell that story of how we have been legitimate over time. But it's to a very deliberate Commonwealth Sports Impact Framework that talks directly to not only the values that are in our hearts and that we collectively espouse to, but the impact that we look to have: peace, sustainability, and prosperity. And without peace, you can't achieve sustainability. Without sustainability, you can't achieve prosperity. So there is a very deliberate approach that I think sport is going to now need to, and the way we do it may be very different than the way the Olympics does it. The way that, but there may be some shared value. And so I actually think we need to be collaborating more than ever, versus trying to eat each other's market share.
Okay, that's great. I was seeing the academics in this room nodding their heads about that need for evidence base and thinking that, yeah, close collaborations to be able to evidence some
Absolutely.
of the
Happy to help on that.
I know that Martin's got a big project that could provide some of those evidence bases. Laura, I'm going to give you the last response. We're just bang on time now, so maybe just in a minute or two maximum, just provide your response to that, and then I will close.
Yeah, mine is a bit of a response to David's comment, because I think what he's saying has so much value. But what I worry about and wonder moving forward are those international federations like yours, or similar to yours or others that don't necessarily have the same ongoing value proposition that you have had from a Commonwealth Games perspective, going to be willing to give up power in order to allow those cities and communities to develop and engage these events in a way that they see fit. I think that's a piece going forward. If this is going to happen in the way that you're describing, there is a piece of that power that has to be given up. And I think that's going to take a lot of those international federations a lot of time to digest being able to do that, because they have had so much control, so much power over the events process. In order for this to really become a sustainable process of hosting events, communities and cities must have that power to decide for themselves. So I think that's going to take time. It's enlightening to hear from an international federation that that's the thinking, and we'll see how many others are going to follow suit in their own way.
I agree with you.
Great way to end it. Okay, I'd just like to thank you all. I think that's been a fabulous session. It's been really enjoyable for me watching it here. I know we've had a lot of engagement online. I'm sure they will have enjoyed it. We're also there'll be ongoing discussion on Twitter and other platforms. So please, if you can, join and answer any more questions that come up that are directed towards you. I'm going to bring this session to a close, and then we'll ask you all to leave the chat, and then we'll have another group come in for the final session. So thank you very much for your time.
3. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third and final session of our virtual conference. So here with 4 speakers to discuss festivals, events, and the COVID-19, navigating a global pandemic. So our final session is about creative responses and new events format, adapting to a new normal. And we have here today Alba Colombo, who's a senior lecturer at the Open University in Catalonia. We have Leonie Bell, which is a strategic lead for the Refugee Council. We have Dr. Andrew Smith, reader at the University of Westminster. And we have Tim Gale from the Bournemouth University. And they will all talk 5 minutes for each of the 2 questions that we prepared to them. And then you can also make comments or questions on our social media using the hashtag CCSE Futures. We'll be watching the questions and we may select 1 or 2 so they can answer at the end of the points. So we're going to start with Alba. So Alba, good to have you here. And our first question today is, how have neighborhoods and communities responded to the absence of collective gatherings brought about by COVID-19 measures? The points. So we're going to start with Alba. So Alba, good to have you here. And our first question today is, how have neighborhoods and communities responded to the absence of collective gatherings brought about by COVID-19 measures?
Okay, thank you so much. Hello everyone from Barcelona. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me in this panel, but also special thanks to the Center of Cultural Sports Events for the initiative. I'm really looking forward for the debate. So, trying to answer this question about social and community reaction of response for this absence of social gatherings. Yesterday I was thinking, this reaction has been incredible, sometimes amazing. So accurate, sometimes without logic and control, but once we could not avoid, that has been innovative and coming from non-professional people. And the most important thing is the response of a need that these communities feel. When everything stops, we could not do our life in Spain, like in other countries. For example, we can go outside just for basic needs, food, etc. So then,
Alba, I'm sorry. I think there's a bit of interference with your microphone, and maybe if you have anything else open. So if you have any other website open, just close and then just maybe sit back a little bit from your microphone. That will help us to listen. I think there's just a little bit of repetition. So if you just sit a little bit back, then okay. Yeah, that's better.
Oh, sorry. I didn't get it. So sorry, I get back. So I was saying thank you very much for inviting and a great opportunity to talk to you and so looking forward for the debate. So trying to answer this question about social and community reaction for the response of this social distancing and social gatherings. So yesterday I was thinking this reaction has been really incredible, sometimes more accurate and sometimes without logic and control, but once we could not avoid. And it has been really innovative, coming from non-professionals and people. And the most important thing is that there's a response, from my point of view, a response for a need that this community feel and express. So then everything stops March 2020 in Spain, like in a lot of other countries, we could not outside just for basic needs like food, emergency, etc. But then, I don't know, I think it was like a therapy or response to situation, personal needs, or to be in contact with other people, neighborhoods and communities starts to involve and improvise a clear offline reaction of this social distancing. Well, what I would prefer to say, a physical social distancing situation. So offline social communities reaction, and at least in Europe, it has been a huge initiative with a lot of activities and proposals. But I would like to share with you some examples packed into typologies. I sent links of my examples so someone would share in the social media where all of you are looking at. So try to get inside the links that I'm talking about in the moment that I'm talking about. So these 2 typologies are, first of all, reinventing traditional and popular events, basically looking from new stages, new spaces, allocate these spaces to taller places, And the second typology is the new initiative of events, so inventing new responding of these social needs, gathering, sense of belonging, etc. For the reinventing traditional popular events, so my example, first one are traditional festivals. And in Spain, we have this fantastic Feria de Abril. It's called the Seville April Fair. It's a big event with horses, carriages, casetas, these individual decorated marquee stands alongside the bank of Guadalquivir River. What they decide to have, the citizens of Sevilla, is not canceling it. There is a hashtag called Alumbrado en el Balcón. So go there, you will see balconies, roof, terraces, people doing private parties at homes, decorated their windows, their roof as a caseta, even performing this parade with horses, homes, decorated at streets, linking windows of homes with gardens, like notes between a big networks of balconies and roofs. So the other example is what we call in Catalan Festes Majors, the village annual festivities. There's a lot of examples in Catalonia, like confined festivities, Salrà, Figueres, Llagostera, Linyola. But generally these festivities, what they do is activities and actions from traditional performances by traditional groups like Castellers, these human towers, devils, fire figures, even concerts, literature gatherings, pyrotechnics. My example here is La Festa Major de Tàrrega, just in the middle of May. The people of Tàrrega decided also to move from squares from public space to private homes, balconies, roofs, windows. Participation was amazing in this time. So the second typology, the new imaginative events, inventing new events responding to the social needs, gatherings, and sense of belonging. So, this applause for the health system at 8 p.m. that happen each day as a thanks action for all these efforts that people have been doing to us as a society, but also as a collective expression. So, therefore, alongside this applause, a lot of events have been popping up. My first example is a collective distanced gatherings. The example of the unity expressed by neighbors when once they come together, meeting, dancing, expressing the unity against the virus. And my example here is a cross in between different streets in Barcelona called Mitre, Padua, Berna. Please go ahead in the Instagram site there. It's amazing. So Ronda General Mitre is a big, huge highway in the middle of the city. And what happened there was amazing. Just a personal initiative. One person decided to share their music with the neighbors. And that develops a celebrating togetherness, unity, sense of belonging between people that never been before. Even they don't know each other, expressed by their private spheres, their private realms to others, having them in the middle of this empty highway in between. And even in this situation, they celebrate also traditional festivities like San Jordi. And my second example of the new activities are the spontaneous individual performances. Sure, in any of your city, so one singer, one musician, professional or not, decided to share their experiences, their music. My example here is Begoña Alberti, the soprano opera singer in Spain, and there's a very nice YouTube video about her showing an area in March 17. Concluding, so identifying these two typologies of activities popping up from communities, try to answer these needs. There have been a clear need from my point of view of collective face-to-face participation when the pandemic, sense of belonging, community construction, reivindication of traditions, unity of, and also partying together, and of course sharing everything online through social media. But also the space, what is one of the main points in our share research project, Fast Spaces. And Bernadette Quinn said also at the beginning of the session today, so we post a very interesting post in our blog, so go ahead also there to take a look there. So activities switching from public spaces to private ones, disappearing these boundaries between dimensions, this private dimension and public dimension. Space like windows, balconies, roofs in these European countries, places that generally we use as a space from to be seen or to see, as a space to where to participate. As I said before, like nodes, linking these big networks of participants. Therefore, and I'm finishing, if we go back to think about what was happening before March 2020 and COVID, and we see which kind of initiative communities have been doing, wow, it was really, in terms of social events and social context, as a society, we had a lot of needs. And I think there have been some examples with these two typologies that I taught you to try to face them, these needs. So I think, yeah, I think I'm finishing here, and then we'll go talk afterwards in deep and other things. Sandro, we could hear you. We couldn't hear you.
Yeah, that's the first thing. Unblock your microphone. So thank you. I think we will definitely get back to some of these points later on, and I'll let Leonie now point her views about the same questions about neighborhoods and communities.
Thank you, Sandro, and thanks, Alba. I knew it was going to be quite hard to follow you, and you'd be more rigorous in your analysis than I've been. And hi, everybody on their computers out there. We had a little pre-meeting just before we came on, and Sandro said he didn't want to talk too much about the roles that we do, but actually I want to talk about the one that I've been doing because it kind of matters to this conversation, and that I was redeployed in the local authority in the first week of lockdown, and I suppose I'd gone through a bit of a process of trying to find a sense of purpose in my cultural regeneration role, as we were in the context of, you know, new language like furloughing and critical service and key workers. So being redeployed felt like an opportunity, but I was also frightened. I was worried that I would lose my connection to culture and to the sector that I've been part of for 20 years. And I have to say that I don't think I've ever been more wrong in my life, and that what I realised when I started helping to support the council and its partners in its humanitarian efforts was that actually what I was getting was an incredibly enriching experience and witnessing of the importance of local culture, of everyday creativity in the heat and the pain of a crisis, which was either being hurt by the virus itself or by the kind of phenomenal strength of the lockdown. So I suppose I'm kind of reflecting on both perspectives that I now have. One is somebody who's worked in culture for a really long time now, and somebody who's just started brand new in a job, working with volunteers and experts in poverty and community partnerships and engagements and those sorts of things. So building on a lot of the stuff that Alba's been saying, there's been so many, I guess, kind of things that you have emotional responses to and kind of blow your mind, and then you become pragmatic again. You ask yourself not just the what people are doing, but why are they doing it? And I suppose that's a bit of a refrain to some of the reflections that I'm going to share with you now. So maybe before we leap on to what our communities and neighbourhoods doing, I think we've got to start in the home and what our households doing. And it's when that accumulates together that you get community and collective action. So things that households are doing when they're lucky enough to have space within their home and access to space outdoors, and lucky enough to have digital access, whether that's in terms of infrastructure kit or time to get onto it, is that they are communicating in a whole host of ways. And I think it's the everyday individual creativity that's actually making this a collective human experience as well. And that's things from the Zoom backgrounds we're choosing to our lockdown outfits that we're all wearing. And some people who maybe wouldn't see themselves as being creative are actually being really creative. And it's the film nights we're doing, it's the quiz nights with family and friends, it's the TikTok films that our teenagers are doing relentlessly. It's all of those things. And it's also the kind of chronicling of our time, of us all trying to make our mark on social media or on the rainbows in our windows that our kids are doing. And all of these, I guess, go back to that question of why. I think what I've seen within the crisis and local communities is a deep human need and a deep human right that people have to create and to connect. And that is something that when we go through this conversation, I want to come back to in terms of legacy, that we mustn't let go of. So if that's the household, you then grow from your household into the neighbourhood and into the community. And then you quite quickly get into the national. And Alba, you may not know who this guy is, but there's a guy called Joe Wicks who a couple of my kids are doing every single morning. It's sport, which David will like, but there are these things that are connecting us every single day. There was also something in Edinburgh, maybe a middle class area in Edinburgh, I don't want to make assumptions about it, where on the nice sunny days there was a really long street that did a chopped hopscotch where everybody participated in it. But actually, I think for the first time we're seeing that culture shouldn't be deemed and shouldn't be seen in terms of class, the social strata that we too readily have divided it up with before. Actually, we have the opportunity to let go of that, let go of those models. In Fergusley Park, an area that probably has a bit of an image of being one of the most deprived communities in Scotland and the UK, actually has shown unbelievable community endeavour and creativity. There's community groups working there in contact with every single household. and there's a bus going around at night, going around the streets and playing bingo with people. So there are things that kind of, I suppose, just make you full of joy in the most worrying of times. And there are many, they're local, they're in households, but then they grow and they accumulate. And then I can't not mention the clapping for carers. And I think there's something in this. And Alba, I don't know if you know what that is, and others from around the world, but every Thursday, millions of us go on our doorsteps or balconies or back doors and we clap to thank those people in the NHS. But actually, it's maybe losing its meaning as the death tolls rise, as the economic Armageddon becomes real for many people, and as the political behaviours of some becomes more and more dangerous. But there's something in that need for civic and collective gathering that's really important, really important. And I'll maybe end on that and come back to some of those other points when we answer the next question. So thank you, Sandro.
That's perfect, Leonie. Thank you so much. So we'll move to Andrew to listen to your points.
Hi, yeah, hello everyone. Yeah, for me, a little bit like Alba and Leonie, I think the community responses have been both fascinating and quite uplifting, really. So all the improvisation we've seen, people obviously have a thirst for sociability, for sociable events, for collective experiences. So actually, despite the lockdown, there have been lots of micro events taking place, and I think that's interesting to look at. And again, some of those events are not, despite the lockdown, they've happened because of the lockdown. They're ways of coping with adversity. So, it's a coping strategy as much as a sort of ongoing thirst for events and for social connections. I've, a bit like Alba, typical academic, I've tried to sort things into categories. I've got 4 categories. I don't know if you can see them, but they're all begin with I. The first one is really thinking about these informal neighbourhood events. So informal sort of improvised events that happen in the UK, at least on sort of streets where people maybe engage with performances, they take part in group dances and quizzes and other occasions that are similar to that. And I think they're really fascinating because there's a lot written about the eventful city, but very little of that work thinks about making local neighbourhoods more eventful. And these sorts of events are happening. Obviously, they're quite small scale, but their significance is as much their location as their sort of scope and scale. So I think that they're really interesting to look at. The second type are illegal events. So people don't often like to mention them, and don't worry, I'm not going to snitch on anyone. I'm not going to sort of dob anyone in, but there have been lots of events that have taken place around the UK that contravene all the rules. So we've seen big parties taking place in parks. We've seen street parties that have gone out of control. There are raves now reported on many Britain's beaches. There are raves happening in nature reserves. There was a protest a couple of weeks ago against lockdown in Hyde Park. So we shouldn't forget the fact there's a lot of illicit events happening. And again, the thirst for events sometimes spills over into some events which aren't necessarily very helpful. The third sort of type I've got is not necessarily about communities. It's more about sort of the event industry continuing despite the lockdown. So we've got a whole set of ingenious events that have been staged. And a lot of those, or the best example of those, I think, are these drive-in events that someone mentioned on the YouTube feed. So we've seen across Europe drive-in cinema, but also drive-in rock concerts, a really good example in Denmark and other examples in the US. We've seen drive-in nightclubs. There's a famous example in Germany, the Auto Disco. We've seen drive-in comedy festivals, and even in the Czech Republic, drive-in arts festivals. So again, this sort of fascinating, not necessarily new type of event, but a revival of an event which we thought maybe had become outdated, the sort of drive-in cinema. So I think that's really been interesting. And again, if anyone's interested in following that up, there's the Henley Festival this year, which takes place in July, has been turned into a drive-in festival. So it's called the Car Park Party this year, and it will host live comedy, live music, live movies, all happening to a drive-in audience who obviously pay £35 to park their car and consume these events. So there's those sorts of events. And then finally, there's obviously the internet set of events. Everyone's talking about events that are going online. And for me, the most interesting example of internet-based events, this is the fourth category, by the way, are those where live events and online events are blended. So there are some examples. I mean, football now in Korea is a good example where you've got a Zoom audience interacting with the live action, and you've got and the drive-in rock concert I mentioned before in Denmark involved the artist engaging with people in their cars, not necessarily face to face. He couldn't see the people through the windscreens, but via a Zoom event. So you've almost got a Zoom event and a live event happening simultaneously, which I think is quite an interesting trend.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Andrew. So moving to Tim to listen a little bit about your points, Tim.
Okay, thank you, Sandro, and thanks to Gail and colleagues as well for inviting me here today. It's absolutely lovely to be here. And what I've done is I've just previewed a few things I'm going to say on Twitter. This is a shameless plug, by the way, to follow me at TJ Gale. I'm also using it as notes because I have a 3-second memory here, so I need to read what I actually said. Just in response to the first question, I think inevitably during lockdown, we look to ourselves, our hobbies, our interests, and what we would be doing in terms of events and festivals if business as usual carried on. And I'm speaking in a capacity, a number of things really, as a rail enthusiast for one, also an adult fan of Lego and a retro gamer. Now I appreciate that makes me look really geeky, but there you go. Any street cred I had has disappeared years ago. It's really interesting to see how people who share those interests have engaged and maintained those interests online, particularly. In terms of the railways, this would have been peak season for rail tours and Heritage Railway steam and diesel galas, and their cancellation, is a huge blow to the sector. You're talking here about third sector organisations, charities. They rely on the revenue from those events, but in terms of the people who would have participated in those, they've very much moved online. So we see things like virtual diesel galas, like those organised by the Swanage Railway. Another favourite of mine was after the cancellation of the London Festival Railway modelling, we had the Twitter model train show taking its place, with folks sharing their model train layouts and operations from their bedrooms. And there's something really creative and innovative about this, and quite democratic as well, because only the best layouts get to be displayed at these shows, but everybody had a chance to create something and share it with like-minded people through social media using that hashtag. And it's going to be a long time, as we know, before normality resumes. In terms of rail enthusiasm, anyone will know if you've had to catch a train. It's very difficult to socially distance on a coach in a compartment. But some things, may be possible now, like line side photography. But that virtual has helped people connect, and it's made up in a small part for the sense of loss they've experienced by not being able to participate in those events and to engage socially with fellow enthusiasts. And the same is true for the Lego and for retro gaming as well. I mean, especially so here, because those are very tactile hobbies, if you like, building Lego with kids and friends, family. You're talking about bricks and toys that pass through the hands of many there. Likewise, retro gaming events, you tend to actually play the games on the actual equipment itself. Now, in terms of hygiene and deep cleaning and social distancing, that's an absolute nightmare. And again, the virtual can compensate to an extent for that. But those will be some of the last events to actually come back. So maybe we're looking at some kind of virtual remedy or replacement for a long time yet. The tricky thing, of course, is it's very hard to monetize those events. Photo, video sharing, live streaming. It's great to connect people. We can raise some money for charity, for instance, but it's no replacement, of course, for the real thing. And those sort of 3 examples I've given from my own interests there. Attendance at the actual event, co-presence with fellow enthusiasts. That's everything. And if you take that away, you've got to ask, what's left really. So so I suppose I'm waving the flag for the virtual, but acknowledging the limitations. You know, I think, as Andrew said, it's a bit of a stopgap, a coping mechanism for those of us who can't engage in our interests and serious leisure and the events and festivals that take place around that. Okay.
Tim, thank you so much. Actually, just for two reasons. One, for because of the time, considering that the time, but also because of the points that you just raised that are really connected to the second question that we have. So I'm going to go straight to the second question that we have, and then I'll come back to the questions from social media, because I think the points you were raising are really connected to the idea of the new and adopted forms of festivity that will be sustained once social distancing measures are relaxed, and what's going to happen next. So would you want to start to comment on the second question, because I think it's quite connected to what you just said?
Okay, sure. I'll do that, and then we'll take questions at the end. Then, yeah, that's great. So, in terms of the second question, then, I mean, this is really interesting for me because I've been arguing for longer than I care to remember now that, and I'm coming from this as a tourism specialist, that the future of tourism may not involve much travel at all, and we may actually consume tourism and tourism-like experiences closer to home and even within the home in the case of virtual reality. Now, I haven't got very far with those arguments over the year, particularly with my students who are very skeptical and cynical about some academic indulging his interest in virtual holidays. And so I've been a bit of a lone voice on this, but of course, COVID-19 has changed everything. It's turned the world upside down and reconfigured, or is reconfiguring leisure, tourism, and events. And so the examples and cases from my own research that I used to prosecute this argument, I've done some work on urban beaches where we recreate beaches in the middle of the city. Started with Paris Plage, but we see it with Rome, with Berlin, in the UK with Bristol and Birmingham, Cardiff, and so on. They've all staged these urban beaches where you create the beach out of sand from nearby quarries, put a few deck chairs, palm trees down, bit of decking, a bar, a cafe, and create a beach-like atmosphere, perhaps close to a water body like a river. And everyone behaves as if they're on the real beach, even though they know very well they're not. So, and also fantasy worlds, like things like Second Life, for instance, which again, you know, I wouldn't necessarily advocate taking holidays in Second Life, but if you think about it, even now, users commit so much time to engage in these virtual worlds. I suppose you've got more recent examples now with Animal Crossing and some of those games that my kids are interested in playing now as well. So very immersive. And also recently I've developed an interest in what we might call immersive cinematic events like Secret Cinema, for instance. And that all started when they put on the production of Back to the Future in the Olympic Park. And you know, creating the attendees being actually part of the movie, so not just watching the spectacle, but actually dressing up and engaging with it and seeing acts from the movie performed live in front of them. And also recently, I'm developing an interest in urban arts trails and character arts trails. Now, in Bristol, where I live, we have recently had the Gromit Unleashed, to the Wallace and Gromit cartoons, and so there's statues of Gromit the dog throughout Bristol, and you collect them and take selfies with them, and put this all into an app to show your friends that you've done the lot, you've collected them all. And I think these are the sorts of events we may see in the future. We may see more of this in the future, where we're not traveling as much as we're used to in the past, and where perhaps the event industry steps up and fills the void, if you like, left by long distance travel, which has become prohibitively expensive. There's perhaps fewer airlines routes, low cost flights, been and gone. So this is my argument, really. This is what I think we'll see in the medium to long term there.
Thanks a lot, Tim. Andrew, following from that, so is that the new forms of festivities and festivals that you see sustained after social distancing changes?
I mean, of the ones I mentioned before in my previous contribution, I think the shift online is probably the most obvious change that we're going to see. So I think there have been lots of new ideas tested, and I think that, that is a trend that's definitely going to continue, and this whole period has accelerated that change, I think. And I don't necessarily think that's a very good thing, by the way. So I think that's not all positive. That's mainly, in my view, negative. I think we all value face-to-face events, and the sociability of events is absolutely key to their success and their impact. So I think that's not necessarily a positive thing. I think I mentioned driving events, these atomistic events where we've got small groups of people consuming events together. That obviously in the short term is a trend that's going to continue, and we may see more events consumed in that way. So that idea of a small group of people, collectively experiencing an event, but without interactions with a wider group of people, I think that's something that we may see more of. And again, I don't necessarily think that's a very positive thing either, but it's a practical solution in the short to medium term. I'll try and finish on a more positive note. I talked about local neighbourhood events, these street parties, and the way in which maybe streets have been reimagined and transformed during the COVID-19 lockdown. And again, I'm not sure whether they're going to be sustained once lockdown is over. But one reason to be optimistic is the fact that there was already a bit of a shift, certainly in London and other parts of the UK, towards reimagining streets and rethinking what they were for, trying to animate them, thinking about people's local neighbourhoods and whether or not they could be closed down, more regulated traffic, and whether or not certain events could be staged. So certainly in London, there's been a shift towards active travel and trying to reinstigate play onto city streets. And so actually the lockdown sort of period, combined with this wider trend for reimagining streets, transforming streets, I think could actually leave a positive legacy. But what we know from behavioural change is that that's most likely when we get systemic changes, when processes actually change. So what I'd like to see moving forward to support this new breed of events is initiatives to make it easier to stage street parties and to close streets temporarily, to introduce new activities. I mean, going back to Tim's contribution, there's a really interesting project in Holland called Vacation Streets, where they're asking people to take their summer vacation this year on their local street, and then with various installations placed on their street to make them more interesting, like little paddling pools and play areas. And so I think we should try in the future to make it easier for local communities to get involved in those events, to actually close their streets temporarily, and maybe even think about introducing more regular closures, maybe every Sunday or one Sunday in every month for certain streets. And I think the combination of what we've experienced over the past few months, but with some changes, and then bolstered by this trend for reimagining and reanimating streets, with lots of other agendas involved, including the climate change agenda and other transport related agendas. I think the combination of that may leave a more positive, sustained legacy.
That's so interesting, Andrew, because that takes me back to Brazil when I was young, and we used to have those type of recreational streets that the government would close for the weekend, where the community could go and reimagine games and activities and events in a different way. And it's very interesting that it may be the opportunity to reclaim the city somehow. Further.
And at the moment, it's still, in the UK at least, it's very bureaucratic and difficult to arrange that, to actually get permission to officially close. You have to have the agreement of almost all the residents locally, and it's a very, very cumbersome process. If we can find ways of changing that, I think it would be great.
Good. Leonie, going back to you then, what's your view about that and about the world of festivals and events after social distancing measures changes?
Thank you, Sandro. It's just so great to hear everybody talking, because I've thought some of it and then not been able to think about some of it. So it's kind of changing my mind as I listen, to be honest. I suppose to pick you up on how you described that there, I'm not sure when we'll get beyond social distancing. I think it could be part of our lives for a really long time. So maybe a little bit like Andrew, I'm coming at this from quite a broad societal angle rather than maybe from within the models of how festivals and events will evolve, because I think we have to ask ourselves what we want to come from this, not just what's going to be left as a result of the economic impact, if that makes sense to people out there, and collectively, what are we going to do to try and achieve it? So for Scotland, what sort of country do we want to be? What sort of neighbourhood do we want X, Y, or Z to be? I think there's a real opportunity to bring the local, the national, and the citizen resident together in a way that we haven't ever actually done before. We have no greater reason to do that than now. And then, as Andrew was saying, I think there is more than just COVID that we're wrestling with. COVID has maybe highlighted some of it. We're also wrestling with climate change, economic and social inequality. COVID's held up a giant mirror in our country and in our neighbourhoods to that, and we have no excuses but to not see that and understand the impact of that on people's lives across generations. And then there's something about the psychology, the emotional responses, all of this. I find these sessions really emotional, and I'm really surprised by my emotional reaction seeing colleagues from around Europe talking about the devastation that is going on, but then the kind of human response to it. And in the first session, I was trying not to cry, and I was really, I really shocked myself. So there's something, but is there something potent within all of that? Are we changing our values, our sense of responsibility? Are we becoming kinder? Can we mobilize all of that together in a way that we haven't yet? And obviously creativity is a massive part of the social glue of all of us, no matter where we are around the world or what community that we're in. So 3 final points, I guess, Sandra, that pick up on points that everybody else I think is making as well. But one is about place. And I suppose I'm quite steeped in regeneration and thinking through how you change places physically. Something that Louisa, my colleague, picked up on earlier is that we use Paisley as a site for events, as a physical context for artists and other creative people and organisations to respond to. We want people to gather in it and inhabit it in certain ways, and all that's kind of up in the air at the moment. So do we need to almost extend our view beyond the focus we've had on high streets, town centres, city centres, so that we are thinking much more about neighbourhoods as separate places, but also connected places? And that's something that I and colleagues have already started to speak about. Does everybody have equal access to high quality public realm, to good pavements, and to good green space as well, all of which have become kind of fundamental human rights over the past 10 weeks. And you really see the issues if you don't have access to those things in terms of not only your physical but your mental health and well-being. There's also something about that active transport. I get kind of frightened when we talk about driving stuff a bit too much, because it horrifies me, the thought of us all being in our cars, but I also get it. So I don't know if there's more around kind of bikes and handing spaces over to pedestrians and residents more that is interesting. There's a relationship too between geographic footprint of an event and programme and access to audiences. So I think the Fringe in Edinburgh have already started doing this in terms of Leith being on their map. The International Festival in Edinburgh has made a massive shift in its programming by where it does it. In Leith in Edinburgh, that wasn't part of the kind of view of the major festivals in Edinburgh for a long time. Sounds crazy, but it wasn't. And then there's that collective moment again, and it's picked that the clapping has been at the fore of in what we've been doing in the UK, and it is a terribly British thing, but actually I think every street and household does it slightly differently. There's something that Bernadette also mentioned earlier about Ireland. There's something in the collective moments in the job I'm doing around the humanitarian support. I think there are thousands, if not millions, of untold stories that we're not hearing at the moment. We're only hearing certain views. So the power that culture has to offer reconciliation, to offer an airing of those really difficult and different stories to come through, and actually to start thinking about healing, reconciliation, and commemorating in a household context, in a street context, and then in a community one, a national one, and maybe even an international one. That's really, really important. And then the third point, just to finish, really is, like many people, I suppose, around the laptops, I've read the Charlotte Higgins article that revisited why the Edinburgh festivals were established in the 40s with the hope of healing and reconnecting, and about economic renewal after the devastation of the Second World War. I don't like the war rhetoric that's used around this, but what actually really stayed with me in that Charlotte Higgins article, I think, is our biggest opportunity, which is she reminded me that within the same political breath, we established the Edinburgh Festivals in Aldeburgh, but we also established the NHS. It was founded within those same years. And that, I think, is our greatest gain, that if we fundamentally shift how we understand culture's role in our well-being, in our homes, in our families, in ourselves, in our communities, nationally, and how we engage internationally, then I think we have something really, really, really positive to work towards collectively. But different voices need to be around the table. So thank you.
Thanks, Leonie. That's great points. And actually, I like the way you start, because we talk about social distancing measures should be relaxed. But one thing is measures and policy. The other thing is behavioral, right? Because one of the things that we need to think is the concept of trust. Because nowadays we cross the road because we don't trust that the other person, even if looking well, is not contaminated. So how the concept of trust between people, because we cannot see the disease, we cannot see the virus, then will be maybe reestablished, and policy does not always solve that behavioral problem. So Alba, do you want to make your final considerations regarding this point?
Yeah, thank you very much, Sandro. I think you are really right. So I really like also Leonie your points. So trust, that's the point here. And trust, when we're talking about events and community events, are complicated. I think we need to start to live with it. So, and we start to live with it. That means to start to live with it also in events and social gatherings and smaller events, like Andrew said, but also in big events, like previous speakers have been talking about, sports and everything. So the thing that I think that I hear related that I would point it out are different elements that I pointed out in my contribution through my examples, but also I think, Andrew, with your neighborhoods, digital driving cars events, and even illegal. I think that it's elements that still being there, and they will be there. And there's these social elements, for example, the social need. So even we need to have this trust. We need, as a society, also have this need to be together, to connect to each other. So the capacity of unity, for example, that I show you in my examples from Spain, or the modality to switch from one space to another. So generating this network of private spaces. Maybe there are things that will remain. But also, I will also not be only positivist here and optimist and be a critic. A bit critic is also interesting when we are talking and facing also some problems that this kind of initiative will generate. But linking to my examples again, so a few things, because I think that many of your contributions have been talking about things that I was thinking about, but trying to answer this complicated question. So some of the aspects that I think that will remain or will be a legacy of the experience that we live until now, these community events or popping up community events are, for example, these balconies. So the traditional festivities, not from village annual festivities, traditional activities, I think that will remain, given the possibility to celebrate these festivities in other places, from another community profiles, for example, LG people or people with difficulties or as sick people or other kind of groups, maybe that will be like another ways to be involved in these activities, right? So having other spaces to be a participant. Also linked to the balconies and the private realms. So maybe it's also interesting to consider for different initiatives related to festivities and opening their action to the other social spheres, other private spheres, having the possibility to generate other kind of activities. Okay, I'm thinking of as an academic here. I know, but my examples are illustrative at least. But also the social gatherings on physical distancing times should generate initiatives are examples that I showed of networks and contacts, interaction that never happens before. So that means that will be something like kind of a legacy, maybe. So this example of Mitre, Padua, Varna is exponential. So neighborhoods that never see each other before. And sure, they will be I know that they will be doing something together afterwards. But what I'm not sure is these spontaneous activities. That means activities that are the concerts, for example, things that are, I don't know which kind of elements could be remained here as an exercise, or we could keep it as a legacy, more than or behind the social gatherings, experiences that the people had at that moment, or the interest of the kind of music of this person expressed, like I show you with the opera singer. But and doing my final point here, I think what we need to think now, and I think David in the sports session talk also about this. So now we should focus, I think, all of our attention on what we would like to do. because it's really different to consider, and we have been discussing that in our university research group linked to the ERA project. So we will really should and want to recover what we had before March 2020, or we would need to reinvent, readapt, what the colleagues also say, resetting or innovate what we have been doing until now. So I know I finished with the questions, and I'm not answering the question that we had here, but I think that there is some examples of that. And in my personal point is that we need to think which kind of legacy we would like to have for all these experiences that we live during this pandemic period.
That's great. Thanks, Alba. Thank you all for your contribution. So I'll just try to get at least a couple of questions. I know we are just over time, but it would be nice. There's so many questions that we'll try to put together after, but I'll select a couple of them just for us to discuss. So one of them is whether the local authorities and their partners are likely to make temporary measures put in place now permanent. And how will we ensure people can have a democratic contribution to where and which streets and what type of events? Does anyone want to chip on that? Are we going to see real permanent transformations based on the temporary things that we've seen?
I'll come in, Sandra, if you want. Sorry, Andrew, just quickly. There's an interesting example that's been just floating around Glasgow that's been talked about for years, actually, but I think will now get traction, which is the covering of outdoor spaces. That would be interesting, and it builds on the kind of street stuff that people are talking about, but we haven't got a climate. We haven't got the climate of where Alba is. So do we need to really think about a short-term investment for long-term gain and how we understand outdoor spaces? One idea in Finnieston and Glasgow is that you create a glazed roof covering. Buchanan Street's also talked about it. I think there could be legacies like that do become part of our kind of our outdoor spaces that are a permanent result of where we are now. If I understood your question correctly.
Andrew, do you want to chip in?
Again, I'm not entirely sure exactly what they were referring to, but I mean, a lot of the stuff that's happened has been quite spontaneous. It hasn't necessarily been sort of local authority driven. Obviously, some of the stuff they've been doing recently about making pavements wider and some of those interventions, it would be great if some of those were turned into more permanent sort of installations. Something I've thought about a little bit is moving forward into the medium term, when we do start getting events returning and other leisure activities returning, there's a chance that because open air outdoor events or outdoor leisure now seems to be a better option than indoor, there's a danger that, you know, obviously we see a proliferation of activities outdoors, but then also conflicts emerging about people just wanting open space, which is not necessarily occupied by, you know, formal organized leisure, that they just want open spaces to be able to exercise and relax and distance themselves from others. So it's going to be interesting, because I think in the medium term, a lot of things that might have been indoor events or indoor entertainments might actually be looking to go outdoors. And I think we'll sort of regulatory pressures there to think about what will be permitted and where, you know, will we see parks full of restaurants and cinemas, and, you know, because we're not allowed to, or it's harder to have large numbers of people gathering indoors than it is outdoors. So there's lots of interesting things that might happen, and I think obviously local authorities will be at the centre of it. But as far as I'm concerned, a lot of what's happened so far, I mean, local authorities have been great about keeping parks open and keeping essential services running. But a lot of the most interesting things that have been happening have been sort of more community-led and been things that, you know, the local neighbourhoods have actually organised themselves.
Yeah, I think that's it, and I think that is almost a reconceptualization of the idea of leisure, and not only in terms of public policy and governments and how they see leisure and what type of leisure they can offer and facilitate to their communities, but also their own families and local communities and local groups rethinking about the concept of leisure and then the events surrounded that. I think another final question that is quite interesting here is regarding the frequency of events. And if they will adapt the frequency of events to accommodate smaller crowds. We'll have that fight again between quantity and quality. We will see like more events, like the repetition of events to accommodate smaller crowds because of the changes in social distancing and the way we perceive social distancing, or not. What do you think?
If I may go ahead. So, I had an example for the question before, so I will start with that one, and then I go to the second one. So The first one is maybe I'm so focused on the power of the communities and the social gatherings, and so. But the example that we have in Barcelona is extremely how the authorities, because I don't really know and feel that the local authorities would have really a point here. I mean, the example that I have of Barcelona, it was that we have a mayor in Barcelona that she wanted to really celebrate the end of this situation, and she invited different people to do a concert in their roofs, linking with these balconies, etc. And all the cultural sector has been against that. So identifying that as a promotion or even a marketing or something like that. That means I'm really skeptic to thinking how the authorities could generate or improve or articulate something like that. I will think more about the capacities of the communities itself to generate something, and then identifying if the authorities go along with that. So this that's the example that I had for the question before. But trying to answer the second one is I understand it right. So how the crowds will be constructed from now on. So my point of view, and I think that it's related with this fairness and this trust thing. So even the people, they don't want it to be in a very, very big event. So we have seen all around Europe and around the world, big concerts, massive, big music events have been cancelled, and anyone would really wouldn't like to go there. And that is a problem for the sector, of course. But we need to reinvent that. So maybe it should be smaller, as Andrew pointed out in their contribution. Maybe it should be in the other way, as I point out with these networks of small balconies. I say my example would could be all the kind of spaces. Talking also about digitalization and internet, I'm a bit like Tim, a bit skeptic of that. So I don't know if we could do everything online. Therefore, crowds probably should be smaller for events and social gatherings, of course, and big events, but we should think also about other possibilities.
But would that make it less inclusive then?
It depends. In my opinion, it depends, because if you are, and that's another point that we talk about, we didn't talk about really about the social distribution on a city. So we have seen, I don't know what happened in other countries, but in Spain it's really clear which kind of neighborhoods has been really affected by COVID, in which not. Which kind of neighborhoods we could have this fantastic applause at 8 in the evening, and which kind of neighborhoods they do not have even time because they have been working, giving supplies for the rest of the society. So therefore, it depends, yeah, maybe it depends, but inclusive, it depends on which kind of neighborhood you are. In the center of Barcelona, sure, a lot of you know Raval, and Raval have been really different. And if you are living in that area, I think it's a point of geographic distribution and in there, because I'm thinking about these links in the balconies concept.
It is interesting because it adds a little bit of a new perspective of exclusion, no? So, Tim, go for it.
I'd just pick up very quickly, Sandra, on what you said about inclusivity, because the Urban Beach, for instance, was created as a free-to-access event for the poorer residents of the Parisian suburbs. And so if we start putting limits on the amount of people who can enter this space, even if we schedule it, it's problematic, isn't it? And I think some of the examples I gave perhaps lend themselves more to social distancing than others, like the urban character arts trails, for instance. But as you say, we maybe have to have time slots. We maybe have to run these things more than once. We maybe have to make them bigger. These are all challenges, aren't they? To make, the big shame would be if people were denied access to some great events and the social benefits from being there, because out of necessity we've had to implement some restrictions because of social distancing.
Okay, it is a fascinating discussion. We have lots of questions for you on all the different social media platforms. So your task for tonight is to go to all the different social media platforms and answer all the questions that is there for you. You have a couple of hours of work and homework to do. And it's I'll just like to say thank you again on behalf of the center, on behalf of Kay and David. Thank you so much for your contribution and the time we spent together. I really appreciate.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I can't thank you enough. Without all of you, it wouldn't have been possible today, and it's just been such a great discussion from everybody. So David and I are just going to sum up. I try to give a little bit of thanks, but also a bit of a summing up of the whole afternoon. So I'd like to say thank you to Devla, Sophie and Theo, who've been supporting us digitally today and fielding questions from us from behind the scenes. It's made all of this possible. As you may have witnessed, this has been broadcast live on 4 different digital platforms. And we'd like to thank all the people that have been watching, our viewers who've been watching, listening and participating with your many questions coming through on those social media platforms. We have had over 700 people watching online at various different times, dipping in and out today, which has just been phenomenal. And we'll continue this conversation as beyond today. So let me just sum up by saying we convened this conference today. We convened this conference today in an effort to provide a platform to begin to discuss the experience of the effects of COVID-19 on the festivals and events sector. And to sum up, it's interesting that while we've heard much about the challenges that the sector is and will face, for example, tackling the colossal economic effect in the economic sphere, is a real concern that many freelancers, performance agents, athletes will not be able to survive in the sector until 2021. And there are certainly possible solutions to some of that coming forward today. While the cultural sector is still booking for next year, the risk that the increased ticket prices will exclude some audience members is very real. More positively though, technology and digital while not always free, are enablers. They're allowing enhancement, cost saving and a recovery asset, but they're only part of how we may do things in the future. Much of the sector is well used to dealing with problems creatively, working within financial constraints to deliver their work. The pause in activity that's been forced upon us in an opportunity for retrospection and upskilling and reaching new opportunities. The panelists suggest that we consider adaptations and innovations that will enable recovery and reimagining, with a chance to return with better informed events which are relevant to their communities, both rural and urban this time. Currently, it's far from clear how the sector will return. Support is vital, particularly as festivals and events comprise significant parts of our international reputation, which could be lost quickly if not, and cannot be so easily regained. And we heard from Visit Scotland and our events directorate today of the strategies in place to help that process. But what came across for me in all of this and trying to watch and listen to these feeds as we're going along and have all of our team fire questions in and monitor all of that, was a humanitarian effort across the sporting and cultural sector was really evident today. People have felt re-energised by the commitment in local communities to reimagine their own neighbourhoods, to engage in culture and festivity in different ways. But there is still a desire to support large-scale sporting and cultural festivals and events too. What was really obvious is that we should do this with equality, diversity and inclusion at the heart of any vision and strategy we create. Neighbours as connected places beyond city centres, socially and physically accessible, is something that all the key speakers stress we're going to become more important going forward. But this is only the start of the conversation. So I'm going to hand you over to David, who will explain our next steps and how we aim to take this forward. And thank you once again for watching, listening and participating. And please feel free to engage with us at the centre. David.
Thank you, Gail. I'd just like to pass on my thanks too to everyone who's been watching and engaging with us online. I think the quality of the speakers has been outstanding, and I think that probably helps make these kind of events interesting, and people want to continue to engage with them. So I'd like to pass our thanks on to all the speakers. We're not going to mention them all again, but you know them all and you'll see them all on social media. I think we obviously want to make sure that we continue to engage with you. So, we said at the beginning that we would try and cut up these videos that we've now produced, and actually with the consent of our participants, share those with you through the centre. So keep watching out if you're from the centre's social media feeds, and we'll also a distribution list to make sure people get access to those. These recordings are themselves really excellent and will be useful, I'm sure, for you in your everyday activities, and perhaps also in your teaching if you're an academic. We'll be looking to try and pull together some blog posts that relate to some of the themes that have come up here. And I think we're really keen to try and produce a sort of curated document that reflects the nature of the discussions here. Not an easy task because there's been so much interesting stuff, but we will try and pull that together so that we can contribute that to the debates that are ongoing. And I think if there's anything that we've taken from today, we know it's that this is just the start, that there's a lot of change happening, always difficult to plan in a crisis, but we are seeing shoots of recovery, we're seeing relaxation, we're seeing some kind of contours for what the future might look like, and we certainly want to contribute to that. We'd also, finally, I think maybe also want to look at whether there's a thirst or desire for future sessions. You know, this has been a big event, a big conference. We could perhaps break those down into smaller segments and on particular thematic issues, chair and host sessions with other speakers and other contributors in the future. So again, we'll ask you about that through our social media feeds, and if there's a desire for that, then we will try and facilitate that for the sector. So final thanks, have a nice evening, and we'll engage with you all soon.
Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks, Miss. Cheers, Sandro and David as well.